And welcome everyone to the fifth meeting of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee in 2021. Our first agenda item this morning is evidence on the Scottish Government's budget for 2021 to 22. And I welcome to the meeting this morning Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, David Sears, Head of Sponsorship and Funding, Culture and Historic Environment Division of the Scottish Government, Jennifer Watson, the Team Leader with Resource and Capital Investment with the Scottish Government, and Linda Sinclair, Director of Corporate Services and Accountable Officer at the National Records of Scotland. Before we move to questions, I will invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement of no more than 3 minutes. Cabinet Secretary.
Good morning, Committee, and I welcome this opportunity to discuss the Culture and Major Events budget with the Committee and also to outline the Scottish Government's response to the impact of COVID-19 on the culture.
I'm afraid we seem to be having some difficulties with the Cabinet Secretary. I will suspend briefly until we get the Cabinet Secretary back. Apologies. We will suspend briefly. Hello and welcome back to the meeting of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee. My apologies for having to suspend the meeting. We lost connection with the Cabinet Secretary, who we are taking evidence from on the Scottish Government Budget 2021 to 22. Cabinet Secretary, I had invited you to make a brief statement of 10 minutes before we lost you there, so I'll just hand over to you again to again, hopefully with no problems this time.
So apologies, Convener. I don't know how much of my statement you got. It might be helpful then if I know you got most of it, or did you not get any of it?
I didn't get any of it.
Okay, sorry. Okay, well, if we can maybe start again. In terms of the work that we've been doing on the budget, you can understand we're operating within challenging times in terms of our activity. But I want to express my sympathy and support for the culture sector. Obviously, I welcome the opportunity to discuss the culture major events budget with the committee. The contribution that culture and creativity make to Scotland is extensive, and I think we have to recognise the challenges that they've faced over this period, and that's what we've been trying to do in relation to our budget activity. The impact on COVID-19 on people and organisations across the culture sector has been devastating. I appreciate how difficult it's been for the sector, for those that work in it, but the work that they've been doing over the last 11 months, they've managed to refocus resources to produce online content, to operate digitally and reach audiences virtually. It's been hugely beneficial. We've been doing everything we can to help the culture sector recover, including allocating over £125 million of additional funding since the start of the pandemic. In recognition of the impact of COVID-19 restrictions on individuals working in the sector, I'm pleased to announce that we are providing an additional £9 million to support freelancers through the Creative Freelancers Hardship Fund, and I'm also allocating a further £8.5 million to support events businesses, and further details will be published later today. We're working to continue to look at all possible options to protect the sector, its workforce and volunteers as it navigates the crisis. And in light of COVID-19, it's entirely appropriate that next year's budget is focused on maintaining our existing support for culture, including our commitment to screen funding and youth arts, providing additional emergency funding support next financial year in response to the pandemic will depend on the resources at our disposal from any additional COVID consequentials, and we're awaiting clarity from the UK Government on this before we can consider that further. Of course, this is happening in the wider context of leaving the EU. The full impacts of that on our culture and creative sectors are still being determined. EU funding programmes such as Creative Europe provided vital funding, but also facilitated cross-border cultural collaboration, and the UK has so far failed to fully replace this lost funding and are not compensated for the loss of cross-border collaboration. So the UK failed to negotiate a deal that benefits Scotland and its culture and creative sectors. And of course, as you know, international touring is vital to many creative professionals. The end of free movement of people to and from the EU makes this more difficult and could limit the international reach of Scotland's creative sector. So I hope you have received these introductory comments. They're helpful, and my officials and I are working to support where we can the culture sector and make sure it's ready to recover. And it's vital that we can come through the pandemic ready to flourish and bring much needed joy. I think that we all need. Convener.
Thank you very much for that, Cabinet Secretary. As you say, we're now 11 months into the pandemic. So could I ask what lessons you feel have been learned from the response and support offered to the heritage, creative and culture sectors over that 11 months? And perhaps could you look at how you might use any lessons learned to shape your approach in terms of support from now on, and perhaps you could look at to what degree the emergency funding has been reactive, and whether it's possible at all to use emergency funding for strategic purposes.
So for many individuals and organisations, they were in crisis management for from early doors. Remember, even before the legal lockdown, that theatres, for example, had agreed voluntarily to close. So they were one of the first to close very much in the early part of last year. But clearly the sources of income for individual artists can be quite perilous in a situation like this, and the work just completely stopped. And I think, as your committee itself in its previous inquiry had indicated, the relationships with individual artists, support for individual artists, is something that we need to improve on. And I think probably what has happened, despite the fact that I'm sure if I say this, there will be people who haven't received funding that will raise concerns, but right at the start, Creative Scotland moved to put together their bridging bursaries immediately. There was a lot of rapid reaction and response in the culture sector. They moved very swiftly in a lot of areas. And also what was interesting, certainly at the beginning, was this generosity of spirit, that people only asked for what they needed. This was people knew that they didn't know how long they were going to have to survive, but they needed some kind of support and income. We were also very conscious that there are anchor institutions that are, yes, employers, but also in terms of producing creative content. And there was a period where we were very concerned about some of our major theatres, for example, that were about to having to face redundancies for many of their staff. So we moved swiftly. So even before we had Barratt Consequentials for Culture, I moved to set up £10 million for the Performing Arts Venue Fund. But also bearing in mind that issue about how do we support individual artists, we tied funding to institutions to ensuring that they provided and continue to support artists, either to create new work or in different ways. So the support for the venues, for example, also tied into support for freelancers. Similarly, we moved very swiftly at the beginning of the year to say to all the national companies, the festivals, MD who had funding from us, they could keep their funding on the basis that they continued to pay contracts even for work that wasn't done. And that was about trying to keep the resilience in the system. And I think resilience is the key aspect. And I think the other two aspects, which I think in terms of the learning of this, well, I'll maybe focus on three. One, on the theatres, a more collaborative and cooperative approach, both with their community, with their freelancers, but also with each other. And that's what I think is going to be important going forward, that actually we should be able to have a resilience, and I've always wanted to see more work seen by more people and across more theatres. And I think that's likely to continue. That's a good thing. I think also in terms of the creative communities that we had already established, along with Justice, which again is this theme I know the committee is interested in, and working with Justice, Health, different other areas to bring them together to use the power of culture in these areas. And we've enhanced that during funding for that during this year, because we realised the importance of that. There's a few pilot programmes, but we're looking to support that a bit more. And then Culture Collective basically came out of a recommendation that was in the advisory group on economic reform. Now, I'd moved very swiftly with my economy responsibilities to set that up in April, actually, and it reported in June. And one of the recommendations was to have an opportunity for individuals to work with communities and take the power of art and the capacity for creativity from within communities, support it with artists, provide work for artists, and help our resilience in the community. And again, when I'm finalising our funding allocations, I'm looking to support that Culture Collective even further. And I think these are things that will last beyond, and I hope will last beyond the pandemic, but actually that connection between communities, individuals, and the creative sector is really important. And I want to praise Creative Scotland. I know in years gone by there's been criticism of them, but they've moved very rapidly, they've got their funds out quickly, they've engaged with lots of different sectors, and there's been good response from the sector to their efforts in that, and the individuals that worked extremely hard to make sure we could do that really have helped support the sector as we would expect. That they've done very well. The other lesson, and I'm sorry, this is probably quite a long answer, Convener, so I'll finish on this point, and it does affect the budget as well. Obviously, we've been encouraging people to grow their income from elsewhere and to diversify their income streams, but those organisations that have been hit hardest are those that generate funding not from the public sector but from commercial activities. And within my responsibility, Historic Environment Scotland is one such organisation which, like many others, saw a complete and utter collapse of their income, and that's part of the budget we're supporting them. We previously supported NTS because we didn't, supporting jobs has been at the centre of what we've been doing, and we do not want to see the NTS, for example, making so many people redundant when they didn't need to do that. And challenge them back in a conditional funding, emergency funding. We ensured not all, but obviously as many as could be. We supported those individuals so that their jobs could be saved. So lots of lessons learned. It's been hard. It's been tough. People have been very stressed, frustrated. And it's been, I think, very difficult for people to move from that survivability period to get into saying, okay, what are the things that matter? What are we going to do going forward? And I hope with the stability that this budget provides over this next year, that can provide a bit of assurance so that we can take this year as a bridge to whatever comes next. There's no going back to where we were, but we can plan for going forward to what's next.
Okay. Thanks very much. That's very useful. Now, I understand from your letter that the focus on making sure the money goes to artists and cultural freelancers probably isn't replicated in the rest of the UK. It's something that we've done here in Scotland. There's been more emphasis on it in Scotland. I don't know if you've got any figures to back that up, but that would be interesting to look at that. I totally acknowledge what you're saying with regards to your instructions to Creative Scotland to make sure the money goes out to freelancers, and Creative Scotland doing that. And we have had feedback that that's generally working well. But what happens when a regularly funded organisation doesn't pass the money on? What recourse is there if people are concerned about that? How does Creative Scotland check that that's actually happening?
Well, that's obviously a question for Creative Scotland. I mean, the RFO funding, again, is about stability, and indeed the budget that you have there is about providing that additional year, because previously this last year would have been the year that people would have been putting in applications for regular funding or whatever regular funding streams that Creative Scotland put in place. That was just not realistic or possible over the last year. So that the budget you've got in front of you extends that for a further year to provide that stability.
I totally understand why it's rolled over. I understand that, but
that's to the budget. Yeah.
Whether, obviously, they haven't, had the opportunity for as many live events and so on. They're getting their budget rolled over. How do we ensure that they're passing on their budget, as they have been told to do, to artists and cultural matters?
So that would be an operational matter for Creative Scotland. As the Economy Secretary, I would not be interfering with the operational management of regularly funded organisations by Creative Scotland. If there are any concerns brought to my attention by MSPs of this committee, etc., I would certainly want to look into it. Clearly, as with many organisations, a lot of funding is for fixed costs. It's for their own staff, and appreciate that. And I'm not saying that there haven't been organisations that haven't had redundancies, because some have. But had we not done what we've done, then there would be organisations that would have closed. So we've supported individual theatres, regular funded organisations, as you talked about, and lots of institutions who are employers. Clearly, the relationship with freelancers, it's depending what contracts they already had in place. Certainly for those organisations that I have personal responsibility for, the national companies, and in particular, that was one of the instructions that I made clear, because obviously there was a lot of bookings in spring, summer, etc., and we wanted that honoured. It's similar to any part of keeping cash in the system was obviously vital, and that is to individuals. But I'm more than happy to ask Creative Scotland to look at any concerns that you have. You've got any examples where freelancers who've been contracted hadn't been paid. Obviously, I don't know the individual contracts or the individual situations of all of that, but that was the principle of what we were trying to do, and by and large, as far as I'm aware, that did happen. In terms of the comparison with the rest of the UK, and I think it reflects what devolution is meant to be about, is that we understand our sector, we're closer to the sector, we can be more targeted with our sector, whereas I think it's a much bigger theme, much bigger funding pot it's been done in a different way in different parts of the United Kingdom. But I think what has helped, I think, Scotland over this period is the close relationship and understanding of the needs of different sectors between those that are distributing the funding. It's not just Creative Scotland, it's Museums Galleries Scotland, it's also Historic Environment Scotland for different areas as well. That's allowed us to be far more targeted, and I think we have done more for individual artists than other parts of the United Kingdom, but that's because under the construct we have the Scottish Parliament, you as a committee, I hope myself as a minister, have got a better and closer relationship to understand what the needs are, and we just think you cannot possibly have a future for art unless you have that pipeline and resilience and artists that can still create work and not have a year where they're not having the funding to help them support create work.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll need to move on now. We have lost a little bit of time, so if we'll move on to Claire, and can I ask for questions and answers to Claire Baker?
Thank you, Convener. I would like to move on to the issue of the consequentials and the potential funding in the next financial year. As the Cabinet Secretary said, the current budget for this year is set out is largely similar to last year's, but obviously we're living in very different times and very challenging times. As you recognise, the cultural sector is one of the first to close and it's expected to be one of the last to open, and it's optimistic to think it might open at any time before autumn, to be honest, so they are facing a very difficult period. The consequentials, I think they've been identified 147 million. It would be within your own budget. I suppose, how certain is that figure? What consideration has been given to where it should be invested? And that does cover your whole portfolio? Given it was 125 million for culture last year, 147, what proportion is culture expected to receive out of that?
So in relation to consequentials, we understand that there will be provision enough to support the consequentials as set out in the budget, not just for my portfolio, but right across the different parts of government. In my portfolio, the bulk of that will be for employability issues. We had originally anticipated that we would see the consequences of unemployment hitting us in the third quarter of 2020. Furlough being extended, because remember, furlough, there was going to be a drop-off of furlough, and there were so many different cut-off dates, and eventually it's been extended, as I think it probably should have been from the start, it's been extended to the end of April. So we're not necessarily now going to anticipate the levels of high unemployment till the second to third quarter of this year, which is why we need to make sure that there's funding to help support that. And so the Young Person's Guarantee, National Transition Training Fund and employability is the bulk of that funding. For culture, what I have managed to secure in discussions with the Finance Secretary is £22 million. £2 million of that is for our culture collections in terms of their known pressures, again, because of lack of income. The bulk of this, in terms of support, will be for Historic Environment Scotland, and that's £20 million. Now, I talked about the dramatic loss of income, and we've had to support Historic Environment Scotland. They've got, as you'll know, extensive staff responsibilities right across Scotland in terms of their employees, and we wanted to support them. So what you've seen is a massive drop-off in the budget. You'll see there's a line that will be saying that they anticipate £41 million. Actually, that's only £21 million, and the other additional income will come from the consequentials that we've earmarked. So that's to try and keep Historic Environment Scotland as much on an even keel as possible. They've reduced their expenditure by £8 million. They anticipate they won't need to, what they've managed to marshal that, and what we're trying to do is bridge that gap. I've also had to bridge that gap from £13 million from elsewhere across my portfolio for next year as well, but that's basically to try and keep Historic Environment Scotland even keel. The second part of your consequential is what happens next. Well, it's one of the reasons why I've tried to put as much in events as I can, because a lot of the issues, one, they can't plan as yet. We're working with them on an advisory, the advisory group, on what might an opening up look like. But obviously a lot of these events are further down the line, and even if they work and they could open legally, could they operate financially and survive? I mean, the viability of that is questionable. But the supply chain of events companies, if we lose that supply chain, if we lose those companies, even the capacity to put that on becomes challenging. So this last funding will obviously try and bridge into the start of next year to help people, certainly in the early part of the year. We haven't heard anything additional in terms of what the UK government will or will not do in relation to consequentials for a whole variety of different areas, including culture and including events. And so therefore, going into, I think your question is, what about the autumn or further? Well, we'll have to again wait. And as I said in my opening remarks, we need to try and find clarity from the UK government in terms of what those consequentials will be. But remember, you and we're all looking at our budget without knowledge of what's in the UK budget as well. But we've got enough certainty to be able to do some sort of planning.
Thank you, and I do welcome the support that you've identified for events and for Historic Environment Scotland, this areas that have lost significant income. I think you do recognise as well that the support that was put in this year, my understanding is the funds last until the end of the financial year, which is the end of March. And so once we reach April, the additional support packages that have been in place to get the sector through, they all come to an end. And I do accept your point, we have to wait on the UK government's announcements around potential consequentials. But could you maybe set out how you are identifying where the pressure points are? We heard from SCAN, who were in the committee a couple of weeks ago, who said that many of their members have managed to get through this year for various reasons, but actually March and April becomes real pinch points for that part of the sector. And there's a feeling that there's quite a bit of the sector who actually become more vulnerable once we move into April. They have managed to get through this year, but that's when it becomes difficult. And there's huge uncertainty about what support might be available in the next financial year. And I accept that it's difficult for you to plan, but are you mapping out where support is needed and what kind of support would need to be provided?
Yeah. So if you look at the freelancers, and obviously many of the... You can still hear me, convener, but I'm having difficulties hearing Claire. Claire, can you still hear me okay?
I can, Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah. I can hear you fine.
That's good. Sorry, I'm just getting a bit anxious after this connectivity. But so many of the SCAN members, for example, will be freelance artists who will be able to apply to the fund, the next round of the fund that I've just announced, because effectively this is probably the third round of a freelancers fund, and the timing of it is deliberately, as I've set out, because the last round of freelancers just finished on the 1st. It closed on the 1st of February. This funding will now be able to be distributed, I'm hoping, an effort in March, which would again provide that bridge that you're talking about. Similarly with the second round of...
It's just the SCAN members, they raised the position of the galleries, of the contemporary art sector.
Of the institutions. Okay, well, in terms of that funding, I'll take that away and speak to Creative Scotland. They'll no doubt have been liaising with them. Some of them will be RFOs, some of them might not be. There's an open fund as well that they have as part of their funding to help different projects. I was giving you an example of grassroots venues, the second round of that. Again, that was to help. It set some alarm bells ringing because we had agreed with the grassroots venue funds and the music venue trust that would help through to June. People were making assumptions of the route map, which is not. It was just to say recognising that we're unlikely to get back till that period. So I've tried where possible to use the consequentials to help bridge into next year, and I'll certainly be happy to look at the studio situation that you've raised in particular. I've seen correspondence from them on that, but obviously, as the convener said, a lot of our focus has been in artists, but there's fixed costs, and if you're closed, that's the other issue. If you're retail, if studios have been allowed to open for work, because we know the importance of, and actually the well-being importance of artists being able to work, and that's one of the reasons why studios were able to work even in the higher levels. But from a commercial point of view, if you're closed as retail, you can also then obviously apply to the regular business funds in terms of being closed, because you're legally required as a retail outlet to be closed. So but happy to look at the SCAN issues a bit further.
Thank you.
Okay, we now move on to questions from Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thanks very much, convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just some of the areas that I was looking to cover have been covered by Claire Baker, so I just wanted to kind of ask quite, I suppose, openly, really on the back of that, where do you recognise that there are still gaps within funding, either the sector or individuals within the sector? Where are the areas of concern for you? that you've identified and have been identified to you, and also of the funding that has come into your budget, your budget streams and your areas of responsibility, how much of that funding has actually already gone out, been allocated to those individuals or organisations that need it?
Okay. So in terms of what's been paid out, the vast majority has. Obviously, the stuff I've just announced today hasn't, for the reasons we've just set out, because we've just closed the freelancers fund. Previously, we're actually in the middle of an events funding. This is hopefully I'll be able to top that up, because I expect the demand will be more. That relates to your first point. Where do I see the pressures going forward? I think it's going to be events and festivals, because for them to be able to reopen the numbers that they need, were obviously challenging during the pandemic, and that's my concern. So one of the things I think is really important, I've raised it with Oliver Dowden and supporting DCMS in their calls to the Treasury in this, is to look at some kind of underwriting system, because there'll be some events that can take place and potentially behind closed doors. They might get some sport, for example, can get filming income, for example, from television, and some of them could hold events with a little bit of subsidy in the early part of the summer, potentially, if we're allowed to do, if legally we can do that with the revision of the strategic framework and what can be done. But I think if we could have some kind of underwriting, that's what I've asked, and we're trying to work with DCMS to get the UK government to agree. They've done a similar underwriting for film and television, and that's helped to ensure that many activity can take place. And I was recently in correspondence with the CEO of STV, and they've said it's been very helpful for them in their planning, because obviously there's a lot of initial outlay for events, there's initial outlay for film and television as well. So what we want to do is have sufficient confidence for events to be able to go ahead. Now, if you look at Germany, for example, they've developed this underwriting insurance for events for the second half of this year, and that's the sort of scheme that we've brought to the attention of the UK government. We wouldn't be able to do that within our own competencies, so we think that would be required from the UK. So if you were asking me where I think the stresses are, where the support might need to be. Now, you can see monetisation of festivals through digital, but to the extent that can help cover what they need, that's a challenge. So that, frankly, is where I think the challenges is going to be fest events. And for Scotland, because these are disproportionately, I suppose, important to us, that matters. And I'll be frank, it's also where looking at how we can look at travel across Scotland between different areas, but also with the market that's England, also potentially with Ireland, with a common travel area, depending when discussions might go in terms of if we are going to have hard quarantines across different areas because of variant viruses, what does that mean for a summer market, in terms of that area? So I don't have all the answers, but we're doing it. Can I apologise if you're hearing beeps? That might have been my son getting his breakfast. I'm sorry. We're all homeschooling, and you can't do your schoolwork on an empty stomach. Sorry about
that. Okay. Well, I'm certainly not going to comment on that, but thank you for your answer there. I mean, it's certainly, while there are some extremely important festivals and events in the cities, they're vital for the rural areas too. So I certainly recognise the importance, and I suppose it would be useful to keep if that support is reliant on UK government support, that'd be useful to be kept in touch with how those developments are occurring. Can I look a little bit to the future as well? I mean, one of the issues that the tourism sector has faced has been a lack of clarity about funding, has been a lack of clarity about regulations and when they can open, and and what's required of them. So how can you make sure that organisations looking forward within your area, within the culture sector, are supported into the future, are supported with obviously the additional costs of reopening, and are kept very well aware of when they'll be able to open and what they need to do that? Because, as I said, there's a great frustration within the tourism sector, and actually within business in general, that huge investments going into making themselves, as they see it, COVID safe, and then restrictions come in, which we all recognise are needed in many cases. Restrictions come in, all of that money is completely gone because they've been forced to close when they feel that they've done a lot of kind of groundwork to make themselves safe. So how can you address those points?
So very important points. The underwriting issue is for the major events, not the smaller events. On smaller events, Event Scotland is running a scheme to, even with small grants for small festivals, just to keep them, to have some resilience. So that also has been an area, and I'll make sure Event Scotland share that with you. In terms of the looking forward and trying to provide insight as to what might be possible in terms of the future, we've been working very closely with public health, and so public health officials have been working with the Events Industry Advisory Group that has been established. I helped establish it back in October to try and work out what's possible now. Events, especially the big ones, I'm talking about the major events, they are very heavily regulated in terms of security, in terms of what they do. Obviously, the issue with the pandemic is people coming together, and obviously the volume of that you need to make events function is not where we are now, but obviously we need to anticipate what might be required. So we're working very closely with them to try and share information, trying to think about what events are coming up down the tracks that we can try and anticipate. But there'll be gateways where there'll be periods where people have to make a decision whether they go ahead or not, precisely because of the reasons you said. On a very local basis, I mean, I know, for example, Linlithgow Marches, which is the most important festival in our town. It takes place in June, and they've taken the decision only this week that they don't think that they'll be able to go ahead. So they've just had, because they had to make an early decision, and that's extremely disappointing for everybody. But I know that from the feedback, the town understands that. But we need to make sure that for those events that can operate with in a regulated manner, which many major events are, we can work with them and also find a route forward. But as of today, I can't say when that might be, which is difficult because we're coming close to D-days for decision making for, do they want to plan and go ahead? And that's probably one of the most frustrating things, because I think we need a bit of hope as well, and festivals, whether they're big or small, can bring that. And I don't know if the committee managed to catch any Celtic Connections. When they sold 27,000 tickets online, they reached audiences in 60 different countries. They brought a bit of joy and brightness in January, but there's nothing quite like live, and that's what we have to try and get back to. But we'll try and see what we can.
Yeah, can I just very quickly? I mean, events is one thing, but obviously they tend to be one-off events with annual events. But for those organisations, those museums, those galleries, those theatres within the sector, they don't know when they're going to be able to open yet. And obviously you can't say that, which is, none of us know exactly when things are going to start to get back to relative normal. So, but where can they get clarity, or what clarity can they get from you of funding and support going forward? Because obviously that's going to be vital when, as you highlight, they've got bills to pay, they've got maintenance to do, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So part of the funding, maybe not as high a profile, has been through Museums Galleries Scotland to help independent museums and galleries, and have managed, again, when we've seen the kind of outlay of funds, to be able to top that up at different points. Some of it's for digital aspects, some of it is also to make sure that when they reopen, they can do so in a way that's COVID as secure as they can be. Remember, a lot of museums and galleries could open for a period during the summer, and obviously we worked with the Nationals were very helpful as well in sharing advice with the sector. So Museums Galleries of Scotland have done a really, again, I would like to pay tribute to them. They've played a good role as a conduit and advice for different areas, and obviously that's part of the kind of, which is more of an issue about how you reopen. It's not just the economy, but the creative sector is part of our economy, but it's also for well-being. And I think that's one of the things, what will we do differently in terms of opening up this time? I think there's very consciousness, we have a very good consciousness of the need for people to enjoy CR and to go to places where there might be a bit of solitude, potentially, if we can make sure it's done in a safe way, but also solace in the beauty of art. And I think we're going to have to try and get back to that somehow.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to questions from Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I've got a couple of questions around the support for the screen sector, starting off with the Independent Cinema Fund from last year. That was a very rapidly deployed fund that I think it was announced in September. Decisions were made by the end of October, and I believe the funding was issued shortly after that. While the production sector appear to need less support or less COVID-specific support now than they did a couple of months ago. A lot of productions are back up and running. We obviously don't know when cinemas will be able to reopen, but there's a question about even if they're allowed to reopen, the financial viability of that, given that a lot of the major releases that make them financially viable are being delayed until the autumn and even into the winter. So I've got a couple of questions to wrap into one. Could you just, in the first instance, confirm what the uptake of the Cinema Resilience Fund was like? Did demand outstrip what was budgeted for? But also, what are the long-term intentions around support for cinema? That was a one-off intervention in October. It may be that many independent cinemas in Scotland can't financially viably reopen until as far as next October.
So in terms of the Independent Cinema Recovery Resilience Fund, the vast majority of that had been paid out, mostly in awards over 150,000 and paid in instalments, because that was obviously spread through. It was particularly to help what has been a really good development in Scotland. You've seen the revitalisation of the Campbellton Independent Cinema, Aberfeldy Cinema, that type of cinema. It wasn't for the big city centre cinemas. So again, in terms of they were able to open, certainly from what I recall, and I'll correct myself if I'm wrong, from level 2, and therefore at certain points that they would be able to reopen. And in terms of their kind of fixed costs, I suppose the issue is will they be able to continue? And we think the support we've provided has been pretty generous, I think, and so therefore we think it can help them through the next period. But a lot of it will depend on the opening up. Now, I can't answer that sitting here as to what that will look like. The screen sector, as you said, the actual production sectors have been a bit more resilient, and we've managed to have them opened and very carefully controlled in terms of the regulations. One of the things I've been involved in is establishing the principle of workplace guidance for every single sector across the country, including for events and the culture sector, and importantly for film and TV, working with BEC2 and the UK guidance as well to ensure that activity could take place. But the issue is audiences, and how do we can work with audiences. So I can't, I'd love to be able to say this will happen this is when they'll be able to be profitable, etc. But I know that they're keeping a very close eye on that. In terms of the number of those that were impacted, I do have it. I don't have it to hand in front of me, unless one of my colleagues that's online can give you the numbers of cinemas that were supported. But they were the community cinemas by and large. Independent cinemas in individual towns, etc. I'm not sure, Ross, if I've covered everything, but if I haven't, I'll try and follow up with you.
Yeah, no, that's useful, and I appreciate ask for some specific numbers that might not immediately be to hand. If any officials do happen to have them, if they maybe indicate in the chat box, I'm sure that the convener will bring them in. But otherwise, if you could follow that up in writing, that'd be great. My second question is around the skills agenda. So the submission that we have from Creative Scotland and Screen Scotland mentions they'll be launching a new skills strategy, I think in April. Skills Development Scotland's budget is up marginally. I think it's 225 million to 230 million in the draft budget. And Screen Scotland's funding is stable, which is very positive. With the shift to a focus on skills, now that a lot of progress has been made on studio capacity, most obviously, you'll be aware that the committee's had a long-standing interest in the Memorandum of Understanding around Screen Scotland and its relationship with the other agencies involved in supporting the sector. There's going to be really intense demand for Skills Development Scotland's funding as we rebuild every sector of our economy. Could you explain a little bit what your role will be in ensuring that adequate funding comes through Skills Development Scotland for what sounds like a very ambitious skills agenda from Screen Scotland?
So this is an area I've long had an interest in creative industries and how do we ensure there's a pipeline of activity and there's a real focus there. I think, going back to almost to the convener's first remarks, I think one of the things that the pandemic has brought is it's helped people have closer relationships and partnerships, and I think this is evidence of this as well. One of the bright spots in what is a very gloomy outlook has been the increased activity in screen TV. Lots of people are watching more, and there's a real demand for that. And the expansion of studio space, we've now got vast Studio, there's the Kelvin Hall investment as well, and I know there's more regular more regular activity, for example, in the Pyramids, which is in my constituency. So there's increasing demand for skills, and that has to be met, and we need to have a pipeline there, because creative industries is one of the few sectors that might be able to resist the joint impacts of Brexit and COVID. So the other benefit, I suppose, is being the Economy Secretary. I do have some kind of influence on this as well, and I think that's always been a kind of challenge for the creative industries, is how to make sure it's got its seat at the table in relation to the wider economic recovery. So I can assure you, in my role as jointly as Economy Secretary and Culture Secretary, it's an issue that I've been pursuing, and there's a lot of interest, particularly, and it shouldn't just be for the cities, but I know there's active interest in Edinburgh, for example, Edinburgh College, being able to have that. We always did quite a lot in this area in terms of creative industries, but to do more within that. So there's a green. You're probably aware that there's a green skills climate change emergency action plan that was developed recently. The creative industries is part of a series of how do we make sure that we're planning jobs for the future, but actually a lot of this is of now. So I think this is one of the positive aspects of what's happened, and certainly until it's not published until April, so there's a bit more to do in relation to that. But I think that's a good area, and I would actually, it might be something that if you're planning what your successor committees might want to look at, but skills in the creative sector would be a strong area, because there are more jobs opportunities there, but we need to make sure that we've got people who can either transfer into that, or young people in particular, to see that there actually genuinely is a career opportunities in the creative sector.
Thank you, Convener. I believe one of the officials has indicated. I think David's coming.
Indicated that he wishes to come in. David?
Good morning, committee. I just wanted to come back on Mr. Greer's request for figures for the cinema funding. It was a total of 30 independent cinemas and 2 touring cinema operators who were awarded funding, and between them they hold a total of 103 cinema screens across Scotland. That's about 28% of all screens in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Ross, did you have more questions?
Thanks, Convener. Just if David's got it to hand, the awards that he mentioned, does he know the total amount awarded? I think there was £3.5 million allocated in the budget. Did those awards use up the full budget?
Yes, that used up the full allocation.
Great, that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We now shall bring in Kenneth Gibson.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you very much, Convener. Alex McGowan of the Citizens Theatre said that it would be quite some time for audiences to have confidence to return to venues, galleries and museums, and no doubt music venues will be the same. And of course, Ross has just asked about cinemas. And I think one of the reasons for that obviously will be the impact of social distancing, if we think about how that's going to impact on our theatres, cinemas, etc. What kind of support long term would the Scottish Government consider for these venues? Because I have a concern that if we have, for example, as Nick Stewart said, perhaps a situation whereby social distancing means at a venue with 100 capacity will only take 12 people, then there might be a kind of a tendency to increase prices significantly, because you're only getting 12 people through the door instead of 100. You won't be able to charge 8 times more to get the same revenue, but you would obviously try and increase your prices somewhat. And there can be an issue about pricing people out of attending, some of the venues that they may have done pre-pandemic. So I'm just wondering what the kind of long-term thinking of the Scottish Government is in addressing this whole issue.
So just to give context, I think those activities that might have taken in place indoors, some people will be looking to do them outdoors. So, for example, festivals in the summer are looking to do, they would have, say, the Fringe or the International Festival may do things more outside, not just indoors. That's been reported. But I think Kenneth Gibson's question is about the viability of venues, which obviously I moved very swiftly on last year in terms of COVID response. but a lot of this is down to the space and the transmissibility. So as of, on the basis we've just now in recent weeks had a variant of the virus which we know is incredibly more transmissible than the previous one. So therefore, we've got to think about what that will be in the future. We are getting information about the virus in terms of whether the vaccine itself can that prevent does that reduce transmissibility or hospitalisation, etc. So you can't ask me as a non-clinician and non-health to forecast what that might be. But what we have done, and we did this previously, was to look at if you were opening up, what could you do in terms of if you look at the levels previously, we had indoors, we had outdoors seated, outdoor standing, indoors seated, indoor standing, recognising there's obviously different health risks in those areas. But I would say, remember, the Highlands did have a period where they were in level 1, and the Ironworks did have concerts of 100 in their venue, right? So that did happen during a period where we had that issue. Can I give a blank check to say that we can subsidise all venues during 21-22 when we don't have any additional funding and we don't know what the consequentials might be additional to the culture event sector? I don't know, but if you can bear in mind how I've behaved previously as Culture Secretary and how I prioritise venues initially, I get it, but I can't give you a complete answer. But what you're talking about is exactly what I'm spending my time doing, talking to different events and venues as to how can we do that better. There might be issues about doing it by ratio of space. That's what Northern Ireland does for weddings, for example. That might be a possibility, but currently the cap was at 100 for a venue in level 1, and that did happen. And the Ironworks did have concerts in the Highlands during level 1.
Yeah, I mean, it's just looking at to see how long-term planning is going forward, and I think you emphasise the fact that we've got a more transmissible variant. So quite clearly, we're not going to see a return to what happened previously soon. So this is going to continue for some time, and we could have more variants. I'm not convinced that outdoor events would be particularly great, given the fact that we actually live in Scotland. I went to an outdoor performance of La Boheme, and bits of me were dropping off despite umpteen layers of clothing after a few minutes. So I'm not convinced that's definitely going to be much of an answer to what we're suffering. It's just to see that how can we kind of, with all the funding caveats that you've said, how can we try and secure the future of some of these venues and indeed the people who work in them, obviously, over a longer period of time. So it's to see about what the Scottish Government's strategic thinking is. I realise you're going to have to do a bit of bobbing and weaving, given the fact you don't know about consequentials, you don't know about new variants, etc. But is there any kind of solid foundations going in so that you say, look, what we want to do is ensure that this time next year we still have X number of venues operating in Scotland, and how do we try and ensure that that will happen, regardless of whether have more variants, regardless of what's going to happen? Is there a kind of bedrock position that the Scottish Government has with regard to these, so that we don't end up in a situation whereby, because of lack of consequentials or whatever, then these venues simply close permanently, later in the year or early next year?
Well, judge us by what we've done and what we've been able to do, and I'm not saying that there isn't any risk to any venue, but we've worked hard and managed not only pure venues but also stop redundancies at venues, keep things moving. What would be a reasonable way forward would be a recognition that furlough should be extended. I think it could usefully be extended, as other countries have done, further into 2021. People don't want to be closed. Businesses, organisations don't want to be closed. They want to be open. The furlough isn't a disincentive to opening. So I would encourage the UK government to extend that, and particularly in tourism, leisure sector and entertainment sectors where it's a longer tail. As Kenny Gibson has identified, certainly back to profitability. On rates relief, if the budget in front of you proposes, and we're funding rates relief for retail, leisure and hospitality. We think that could be extended through the year. Again, if you're looking at fixed costs, what can be done to stop the so if you can help support the employee wages and the fixed costs, then that obviously takes away some of the pressure on that. And then it's a funding gap what is the viability difference? Now, a lot of these are commercial organisations, and many of them are charities as well. And I think one of the challenges are, because it's the same challenge that meets both your charitable theatre in your constituency, as well as perhaps a commercial music venue down the road from it. Where does it, if there was a capability of subsidy, and currently as I'm sitting, I can't point to somewhere in the budget that says that's a subsidy for those areas. But it's an area that I certainly would want to try and prioritise. So there's a way of knitting together support to ensure that. But I think it's quite remarkable from what we've gone through the last year, that we've managed to have a situation where we've saved venues, not just large institutions, but also small grassroots music venues as well. And as I said, the funding that we've provided with working with the Music Trust takes us up to, they think that will be helpful up until the June period. So that's some bridge into next year.
Well, I mean, I do think you've done a fantastic job. I mean, £104 million and 7,377 awards is something that's not to be sniffed at, and I do congratulate yourself and your officials for the hard work that's been done on that. And I don't think it's all gloom and doom. I mean, for example, The Rig, the supernatural thriller, it's going to be filmed in Leith. I think it's an investment of £11-12 million, and obviously the Kelvin Hall's been redeveloped as well. So I do think we have to emphasise, that there are positive developments. But obviously, what we're trying to do is to see, as a committee, how we can get more, obviously, from the cultural sector, as I'm sure you appreciate. And one last area is about the National Lottery Heritage Fund. I mean, they're talking about a gap of £25 to £29 million. I know a lot of work's been done to try and bridge that, but what extra can be done, perhaps, to look at that particular sector to see how it can be supported in the year ahead?
So I'm not familiar with when you say gapping. Is that because the lottery, I think, is doing okay in terms of its income? Are you talking about the collapse in income from heritage organisations?
Well, I mean, really, what it is the kind of reduction in income relative to what they need to actually spend money on, I suppose, is the gap, and they estimate that is £25 to £29 million at the moment. So it's about how we can ensure that the money that would have come from the lottery, if possible, to a degree, can be supported by the Scottish Government.
So I would start by saying that we don't anticipate reductions in lottery income. In fact, if anything, we think the trend might be that it's improving because of the circumstances that people are facing themselves in, that they may want to try and have an opportunity to win more in terms of the lottery itself. But I think the challenge it's addressing is what Ken Gibson's talking about. And we understand that, and that's why some of the funding that I have provided in the past has helped there, and we had £3.8 million to protect jobs and reopen issues in for example, New Lanark, the World Heritage Site there, and just in the last few weeks, Historic Environment Scotland have announced funding that was helping in the heritage space, working with Lottery as well, but helping the heritage space for different organisations. So, for example, Queen's Hall in Edinburgh was supported substantially, which will allow them to repurpose. So that they can, because if you've been in that building, how can the circulation in that is a challenge. So it's helping in that direction. And going forward, it's why I want, and that's why in terms of the budget that's in front of you, a lot of my movement is in many ways it's a standstill budget, but the biggest movement is to help support Historic Environment Scotland. And what I really want them to be able to do is to continue to support the grant funding. Now that's a challenge. I have managed to keep £6 million of capital in this budget for Historic Environment Scotland. That's a very recent development, but I think that helps in bridging that gap for investments in towns and villages where there's work carried out on buildings, which is about jobs as well for different areas. So I have, and in terms of how we go forward, by closing that gap on the income reduction of Historic Environment Scotland, and managed to keep our anchor body, because they are the lead body, they're an NDPB, and therefore what they can then do to help other organisations keep their funding, because they don't just fund themselves, they fund other organisations as well. So that's part of the stability there. But it's the lack of income, because a lot of these places, they get income from visiting palaces, visiting castles, you name it, they get an income stream, and it's that, and nobody, whether it's in business or in culture, are getting replacement of lost income. That can't happen. This is about survivability and what is enough to keep people going. But I think it's probably there. It's not had as much attention in the pandemic as the heritage side of things. But I think you're right to raise it, because it is the lifeblood of lots of communities and towns, and the tourism offer. And hopefully, a lot of places you can visit without going inside. So therefore, they can visit those places as well. But I'll look further at what the Heritage Lottery said about shortfall. But I think we're making it up in Scotland in different ways by maintaining and not reducing budgets of Historic Environment Scotland, for example.
Yeah, and the collapse of international tourism hasn't helped. So anyway, thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Our next questioner is Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Convener. I've just got one short, fairly brief question, because there's been a fair bit of questioning on the subject. I want to just stretch a little bit, and that is support for community-based organisations. And in particular, Cabinet Secretary, I'm just interested to know how the Scottish Government is working with local government, because many organisations are supported through local government or jointly with national government institutions. And I just wonder how that's being managed to make sure that as many local able to sustain themselves through to a point where some sort of new normality can be achieved.
So the committee was aware. The committee were aware that there's been extensive support for local government to support a whole variety of issues, and a lot of it is community. In fact, some of it, for example, Aberdeen Arts. It's not local. I would say it's one of the national institutions. In terms of their level of activity and range, they not only got funding from the Scottish Government's culture support, and whether it was the performing arts, and indeed separately I've provided additional funding to Aberdeen Arts as a major institution. But they also got money from what is community funding from local government support funds, as did smaller, more local organisations. So a lot of the support for culture hasn't just come from me, it's come from the Third Sector Resilience Fund that went into communities as well. Also, the funds I've referred to, Event Scotland, have provided a fund that's small level. I mean, some of it's £1,500, but for a small festival organisation, that's what you need to get through your fixed costs to the next year. So, and I think I'll follow up this with some additional funding from Event Scotland as to what they are doing, because that was a fund that was available. So I was trying to get, and Stuart will know from West Lothian Highland Games, for example, as an example of a local community organisation, which I thought, I can't decide, I don't decide funding decisions, as you might appreciate, but that's the sort of level that they were encouraging people to get some funding to continue. The other thing, which is to do with local government, which the committee might be interested in, was there was a lot of concern about ALIOs, which are obviously, the committee, the predecessor committee had looked at this issue previously as to whether the pros and cons of ALIOs, but it also then means, you've got what is essentially meant to be private that has a collapse of income, but they go to the public sector because they're funding. So therefore there's a real issue, and that was the point I was raising several years ago with committee, is that there are pros and cons on this. You might get rates relief and you might get some other charitable relief, but the cost of it is the public sector will still end up, being the first port of call for support. But Kate Forbes, as in her statement, announced even further funding for local government for ALIOs. They call it a lost income. I don't like that phrase, because it's about survivability now. Nobody's getting lost income replaced across the sector, but that's what the COSLA and local and the Scottish Government have been calling this ALIO support, and it's precisely to help and that's like the community galleries, their cultural bodies that are in ALIOs. and so therefore there's additional funding provided for that. I think it'll end up being something like £249 million. Will be helping local government for their ALIOs, and a lot of the ALIOs are in the culture and leisure space, and a lot of them are community. So hopefully that answers some of those points.
Dean Lockhart. Oh, thank you. Dean Lockhart's next.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Thanks for joining us this morning. I wanted to get your views on local newspapers, because this committee has taken evidence on the impact of the pandemic on local newspapers across Scotland, and clearly a number of them are struggling and struggling to survive during this very difficult time. I wanted to get the Cabinet Secretary's views on whether the Scottish Government would reconsider its position on rates relief for local newspaper offices and extend this beyond 31 March, as has been done for other sectors, especially in light of the vote yesterday in Parliament on this matter.
So it's a very important area, and I've discussed previously with the committee the importance of the newspaper sector. I'm particularly interested in public interest journalism generally, not just at the national level, but particularly at the local level. You may have read the Cairncross review, the report. I think it's a very important contribution. I met with Professor Francis Cairncross about it some years ago. Some of the suggestions around public interest journalism support would require, I suppose, discussion with the UK government. I met with, and I've lost track which of the Secretary of State for Culture in the UK government, because there's been a number, but it was some time back, and to try and encourage them to set up some of the institutions that we're talking about, some of the independent institutions to help support public interest journalism, which is not just print media, it's about the future of media generally, would require, I suppose, arm's length, because from government, you have to have a healthy relationship and distance between government and journalism, particularly in a democracy. I feel very strongly about that, which is why I also established some time ago public interest journalism working group to look at some of those issues, because we've got to face up to realities, and obviously the way that people consume their media is different. But what we do need is accountability, and one of the concerns that I know Francis Cairncross had was about how do you scrutinise local decisions, not just government, but as a national government, but local decision making, and the importance of having local newspapers. So back in the summer, when we were approached by the newspaper industry itself saying that they've got concerns, the suggestion was, and it was taken up, that we provide advertising and above what we were already planning to do in relation to COVID, basically as a subsidy to help support the sector because of their collapsed income from other areas. At the time, I proposed, and I thought it was not inappropriate, that the focus should be on supporting journalists and journalism, but I think there was a greater interest to have support for the companies and the organisations themselves through other areas. The rates relief is a smaller amount than the advertising support that had been provided. But in terms of the vote yesterday, you saw that there was a support from the government in terms of the principle that's in there. But I'm not in control of the budget, how things will be carried out. That would be for the Finance Secretary, but obviously I'll make sure that she's aware of your interest in that. But do we want to support local newspapers? Absolutely. Do we want to just do it through rates, or are there other ways of doing it? I think actually there's a bigger, wider debate about the future of journalism, and that's why certainly the advertising support that we provided was substantial and helped bridge that very difficult period. For a lot of local, for newspapers, the support of the Scottish Government kept them going through that very, very difficult period. But obviously the issue on rates relief is live. It's a budget issue. It's something that, in terms of that issue, that lies currently with the Finance Secretary.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. And yes, I very much would appreciate it if you could take this up with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. My understanding is the extension of the rates relief might cost in the region of £1 million or so. But as you know, every single measure helps at this moment. My next question, very briefly, is, and you might not have an answer to this, but do you have a latest expectation, or how is the Scottish Government planning for whether fans will be able to attend the Euro finals in the summer, which is obviously quite an important issue. It's some way off, and I appreciate you might not have a direct answer, but what sort of considerations or what kind of planning is the Scottish Government doing around this?
So clearly, it's an issue that also lies with UEFA and our planning partners, of which obviously the City Council are important, and indeed the police. And in terms of our desire, do we want to have fans or some fans at the Euros? Yes. Do we know now whether that's possible? The answer is no, we don't. But are we coming soon to a point in time where that has to be worked out because of the logistics around that? But because it's obviously an international tournament, there's a lot has to take place in terms of those discussions. So, hope is there, but I'll temper that with a sense of reality. Is that I think there's a general understanding that we might be a bit slower coming out of this current situation, despite the fantastic news of the 1 million vaccinations achieved yesterday.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. Back to you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Dean. We now move on to questions from Christine Graham.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you very much for Cabinet Secretary. On the good news side, the Great Tapestry building is almost complete, and I see that some small businesses are, hopefully once we get through this, opening with various crafts. So we have an anchor business there in the centre of Galashiels, and it's that theme, and I want to move on to things like the common ridings. Across my constituency, Peebles, Galashiels, Pennycook, to name just but 3. Now, these are not only important for local history, but they're terribly important for the local economy. People travel from abroad to return to these events. We have obviously everything to do with the horses, the stabling, the blacksmiths, the lessons in horse riding, but we also have the bed and breakfast, the hotels that get business during these common ridings. I don't know, I've maybe missed this, but I don't know if there's been any support to enable these organisations, I know they're voluntary, but these organisations to continue to, as it were, take over and not to lose all this, for example, in supporting all the other things that are connected to them, the stables and so on, which will be, getting the cost of keeping animals out and no revenue coming in because we've lost all this.
So I don't know. Yeah, so I've already answered, I think, to others that Event Scotland has a fund that was for small organisations to keep them ticking over for fixed costs. Not a huge amount of money, but for voluntary organisations. I'm not sure if that one is still live or that will be closed. So I'll get Event Scotland to provide that information. Depending on the size of the organisation, they might be able to apply for the cultural organisations fund that was in the summer. I don't know if they did that or not. I'm not familiar with that. And I suppose the issue is around, again, it goes back to the question from Jamie Halcrow Johnson, what do I worry most about? I think it's about events and the support to make them viable, etc. Because there's a point in time they have to make a decision. So in my hometown, I've mentioned already, the Lithgow Marches had to make a decision, right? That's similar. People come from all over the world. They don't go on horses. There's a couple of carriages, but not like the Borders riding, which is, is probably a longer period of time. I think you see people are travelling over a number of days from different places internationally. So in terms of that, I would encourage them, if they haven't done so, to talk to Event Scotland, because again, the management of those and whether those are possible will again depend on how they're operating. They're outdoors and maybe more spaced out. There's lots of crowds involved though, and that's another issue, especially if you're a voluntary organisation, because the professional managed events companies can manage risk in a way that's different necessarily than can happen with just people on the streets as part of a community response as well. But I'm happy to ask Event Scotland to look into that area as to what's possible, because in terms of timing and the dates of that, I'm not familiar with. But again, it will tie in with what the rollout of the strategic framework is in terms of what's going to be possible and when.
Well, the first, I think The first one is Penicuik, which is in May, and then we go through till about September. But my concern is that apart from this, it's just very unpleasant not to have these events taking place. It's very important for the community is all the businesses, the little businesses round about, which depend on these events to bring them in revenue during the year. And particularly, let's take the issue of the horses. I mean, there's hundreds of horses used in the gala riding. These have to be stable, these have to be over winter and everything. And they will have no income coming in, because all these lessons that are going to be taken, all the bookings that were going to be done across the whole of the south of Scotland won't be taking place. Are people is there some way of supporting these businesses? I mean, they are, as it were, restricted. Their business is restricted because these events are not taking place.
Yeah. So a number of issues. Is COVID cruel? Yes, on a very personal basis for many families, and it is so, it's caused so much hardship and indeed distress, and there are people who are grieving. But the impact also on businesses there, and as well, and it's hard to quantify in terms of what can we do to help support it when we don't know in terms of the rollout. But I think Christine Green makes a very important point. Events aren't just a one-off entertainment. Events can be the lifeblood of local places and local organisations, and that is why, in terms of the local councils and what they can do, we've now provided an increase on the discretionary fund. Now, the discretionary fund was intended to help those who don't have designated, like there isn't a common ridings fund, if you might say, on a national basis, but they've now got that increased. That has now been increased up to £120 million for councils, and that would allow them to work out who are the key companies within the area, who are the key organisations that would require to be supported so they can survive. And so my advice, Christine, is Borders Council now will be sitting with a substantial increase in the amount of the discretionary fund. And what's discrete or special to the Borders? I would have thought the common ridings are special and discrete to the Borders. So therefore, those companies and whether it's that are suppliers or whatever involved in that might be a route forward. So I can't speak for them. The whole point is I don't decide. It's the local council. That's why it's discretionary. But I think that might be the best route forward if I'm helping her with a constituency case. And great to hear about the Great Tapestry of Scotland location. She knows that I've been instrumental in helping establish and secure the funding for that. Although I haven't seen even in the development of the building because of the pandemic, I've not been able to visit. But I'm very much looking forward to seeing it when it's open. And again, as an anchor organisation, it will help bring people into the area.
I'll send you a photograph. It's right next to my office.
Right, please do.
Just before we move on to Beatrice, you did raise the issue of discretionary fund, Cabinet Secretary. I mean, what does one do if a council has not brought the discretionary fund forward? For example, as a council in my area, I believe it's going live next week. But given that we've been telling organisations that this discretionary fund is there for people who fall through the gaps, I think since back in November, what can you do to force councils to bring this forward? You're giving them the money, so what have they been doing with the money if they haven't brought this discretionary funding forward?
So and I'll try and make this as factual as I can. There was an issue when the funding was provided that the councils themselves couldn't agree the distribution between the councils, because those councils that were in level 4 thought they should get more of the discretionary funding than those that were in level 3, etc. Now, back in November, you can understand where people were at that point. Now we're all in level 4, so I think it's now quite clearly a moot point. It was a much smaller amount previously, because I remember one of the challenges we've had, and I was raising it in a quad call with the UK government just the other day, is welcome to get these consequentials, additional funding, but when you keep getting them incrementally and periodically, it's very difficult to plan ahead. So the fund was much smaller, and it was really just intended to help companies that weren't be able to be dealt with by national funds or indeed by the framework itself. Big challenge going forward is those companies that were legally not required to close but have had collapsed income because of closures. So then what happened was there was provided increased funding, and then, as you might be aware, there was a whole load of schemes. Originally, the taxi drivers scheme, for example, could have been funded out of that. It would have eaten it all up. So therefore, with additional funding and consequential, that was established. The whole variety of different funds that are now out and live. You've got almost £250 million out the door in January for businesses. So again, what happened? I think councils, to be fair, wanted to understand what other schemes were happening, so they weren't duplicating in that area. And then democracy comes in as well, and councils are independent of government, and some of them didn't want to open up the schemes until they had their regular full council meetings, and the cycle of full council meetings can be quite long. So I'm not, I'm just setting out facts as to why that might be. I think the smart councils got ahead, got the money out as quickly as they could. They knew, because they know their businesses, they know the key ones. But the whole point of having a discretionary fund is government doesn't tell you what to do, you decide yourself. So I'm trying to be as fair as I can, convener, in explaining why it's taken some councils so long, I think, to distribute that funding.
Okay, thank you very much, and apologies to Beatrice for butting in there. Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, convener, and good morning. In terms of community spirit on the theme that Christine Graham was going on, that I would just observe that Shetland is very much missing its fire festival season this year, missing the fiery galleys in the middle of a bleak winter. In terms of well-being and people's mental health, and I'm thinking about children and young people particularly, and their access to music. And I noticed that you've already indicated it's a standstill budget, and I just wondered if you could give some thinking behind the Youth Music Initiative and the funding behind that.
Well, I've been a big champion of the Youth Music Initiative right throughout my period as Culture Secretary. I think it's been very successful. It's actually, I think, helped increase the demand for music in schools, and instrumental music in particular. People have probably heard me say this before, is when I first became an MSP, the only pupils that were in a school orchestra were those that were taking, whatever the qualifications were, higher music or whatever. Now, many people in Shetland has always had this culture of more people taking up music. But across Scotland, you're seeing people playing in orchestras, playing in bands, who aren't necessarily taking music qualifications, although the number of taking music qualifications in Scotland, compared to other places across the UK, is really, really high. I think it's been impacted detrimentally by some decisions by some councils to charge for instrumental tuition, and I think that's a really backward step, and I can see it in my local area. What's interesting about what's happened over this period is a real change and transition about how it's been delivered. It's been very frustrating for individuals not being able to play together collectively. There's been really quite a step change in online delivery. I've seen that for myself with Systema Scotland, for example, but also talking to the Royal Conservatoire more recently and the Music Education Partnership Group, and what's been happening there. And I hope that's again something that I think will stand us in good stead going forward, to have more individual tuition that can be taking place virtually if required. But I want that to continue. I think there's scope for greater development of the YMI in other arts forms, because I think it has been successful. Most of the government support is to help primary, and then also to have outside organisations, and we've managed to support them. And one of the, again, really good developments on the youth arts more generally is the Youth Arts Partnership that has received some of the funding from the consequentials this year, to be able to work in partnership with schools to help that well-being aspect of arts in schools as well. But I think in terms of music, it's really important that we have we have really, I think, benefited and understood the power of so many different things through the pandemic, and music and listening to music is one thing, but being able to play it as well. And we need to try and find, particularly in terms of the return to schools, how we can really get behind those young people in the music area. So I appreciate the support from the committee for this initiative. It quite often gets under pressure when finance are looking for where we can go, but I've tried to resist reductions in that budget, and that's why it's going to continue. I'm not sure if I'm addressed exactly what Beatrice is after, but let me know if I haven't.
Yeah, no, I was just looking for support because I believe that music, it should be open to everybody, and sometimes music can be an easy hit to knock off a budget. You mentioned the Royal Conservatoire, and I mean, there's obviously been hundreds of graduates and from there and other arts training institutions trained to support and perform performance technically. So we know that obviously lockdown restrictions have hit them very hard. So I wondered what work government has carried out to find out how many of them have actually managed to start careers in the culture sector this year. Find out if there's a risk that they've turned their backs on culture and start careers elsewhere. And I mean, the same can be said also for the Glasgow School of Art, because they missed out on their graduation exhibition this year. So it's understanding how many of them have had job offers and where that might lead in the long term to the culture budget if we've lost people from the sector.
I don't have that information to hand. That might be easier to pursue with Richard Lockhead, who's the Further and Higher Education Minister responsible in this area, so we can liaise with him on that. What I can tell you is that the Young Person's Guarantee, which is part of my responsibility as well, is not just about 16, 17-year-olds leaving school. It's for those that are older, and we obviously know there's going to be a real challenge for the recent graduates in different areas. It's also why actually opportunities for tuition are really important, and if we can work and find ways where those that are graduates, for example, in music from RCS, they may have a career in music they want to do with a band, etc. That comes back to the point of venues and performances, and indeed festivals for many, but they can also then supplement their income by doing tutoring and support for individuals. So again, the Youth Music Initiative, it's not just important for the young people, it's actually it's a supply of jobs for music instructors as well. But I have regular meetings with the Royal Conservatoire, so I'll speak to them about, I mean, I know in my recent meetings they've talked about well-being and how they've been supporting their students, but I think the issue about recent graduates, not just actually, there's obviously not just the year gone by, but actually there's going to be challenges, I suspect, even for those that are graduating in this year as well. So I think Scotland is very well placed. We're a country that I think has a very strong music sector, and we cannot and must not allow the pandemic to set us off course. I think, if anything, it's actually girded our loins a bit more to make sure that we protect and maintain what's there. And you know, I'm more than happy to work with the committee on this area in the future, or indeed what your future committee might decide to do with future ministers.
Thank you, that's a helpful answer. Convener, I've just got one more quick question, if I may push it. I mentioned one of the questions I asked the Europe Minister was about the access for musicians who want to work in Europe, and obviously there's new complicated arrangements and border checks and additional costs. And I suggested that it might be helpful if government could produce a guidance for musicians and other performers who want to try and navigate the new processes at home and abroad. I wondered what Cabinet Secretary's view might be on that.
So this is a huge issue, and it's one of the real tragedies of Brexit, of which there are many. This was an area that we had obviously anticipated. I constructed and hosted an event with the culture sector, festivals, musicians and artists about what may happen, and we provide that as evidence to the UK government. We had it up in the Dovecote some time ago. At that point, we also had people from different other administrations, and we were speaking with the Welsh and also the the English Arts Council. So there's we're currently helping to provide some limited funding, working with the Welsh in particular, to help a guidance, and it was actually for people coming in, because it's not just about us sending people to Europe, it's also coming in, and that's established. And then what we are going to do is try and see if we can then extend that into the area that she's talking about and doing it collaboratively. More immediately, I've obviously raised this with relevant ministers. I just think that to become we can see Britain being bypassed in terms of goods and other issues in terms of the trade issues, but the idea that we're going to be bypassed in terms of our music and our musicians, and that they can't reach, learn, connect, collaborate. So much of music is about connecting with others and artists working with others from other countries. That's part of the lifeblood of what makes music so great. So I've written to the UK government and secured a meeting with the immigration minister precisely on this issue, to make sure that he readily understands the needs of our artists, our musicians, to be able to tour in Europe. And I'll be able to report back to the committee, I hope, hopefully positively, if he does take my advice and works hard to ensure that the UK undoes what has been a detrimental act in not securing the best negotiation for onward travel and touring of Scottish musicians.
Thank you for that helpful answer. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much, and yes, certainly I'm sure the committee would be very interested to hear any updates on that issue, which we've raised ourselves on a number of occasions. Just before we go, Cabinet Secretary, there is one area that I just wanted to ask you about quickly before we wind up, and that was the letter that you wrote to the committee saying that the delay to the census had resulted in an increase of 18% or 21.6 million in the projected costs of the census. Can you provide more information just quickly on how the deferral has added significantly to the costs of the project, and could you tell us if there has been any underspend at NRS in the current year due to the delayed census?
So the answer is yes, there was underspend this year. The major expense for any census is in the year leading up to the actual census, so that's why there's an increase of 21.6 million for this year. The underspend of last year was, I think, about £13 million, but I'll correct that if that is not accurate. The expenditure for a number of issues, print, logistics and paper capture, external delivery partner, an increase in resource in terms of in those staffing costs. Staffing costs themselves have an increase because, again, that's the year that you would have additional funding, and also in terms of other coding issue, the headcount will be maintained for an extra year, which is the 6.9 million of that, so that's a substantial amount. I think the committee had written previously, we wrote into the convener on the, I think in January, explaining what the increase of the costs would be. But I do have a colleague from NRS on this meeting if you want her to come in to explain more about the increased costs, and we can recirculate the funding proposals. So we save money this year as last year, but it's costing more in the long run, and that will bring the lifetime cost of the programme up to £138.6 million.
Okay, thanks very much. Given the constraints on our time, I don't think I will bring your official in, but if there's anything that you further that you want to share with the committee, if you could do that in writing, we'd appreciate that.
So we'll, the committee no doubt saw the letter sent to you about the increased cost in January, but we can provide an updated one to you, and if there's any changes to that, or indeed replicating what we sent previously.
Yeah, well, I don't expect you to replicate, but if there are any changes or any more detail, I would appreciate that. Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the Cabinet Secretary and our officials for attending and for their evidence today. We'll consider the evidence heard in private later, and I'll suspend the meetings for a few moments to allow witnesses to leave and for the panellists for our next agenda item to join us. Thank you very much. I now suspend the meeting. Welcome back everyone to the meeting. Our next agenda item this morning is evidence on the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And can I welcome the panel to the meeting this morning, Elspeth MacDonald, Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, and Jimmy Buchan, the Chief Executive Officer of the Scottish Seafood Association. And I thank our witnesses for their attendance today, which is greatly appreciated by the committee, and we will move straight to questions from the panel. Can I address Elspeth MacDonald first of all? I understand from what you've told us in the past in your written evidence that the Scottish Fishermen's Federation had three main priorities from the Brexit negotiations. First one was to control access to the UK's exclusive economic zone. Second was to secure a fairer share of quota allocations based on zonal attachment. And thirdly, for the UK to conduct annual negotiations with the EU on fishing opportunities as sovereign equals. Could I ask you, Elspeth, how does the deal that was reached cover these areas, if at all?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I think, as you will have seen in my written evidence, the SFF feels that the deal reached between the EU and the UK on, certainly insofar as it relates to fishing, falls very far short of these priorities. Certainly falls short of what the industry had aspired to and what was possible to achieve, and falls short also in terms of what the UK government had committed to the industry. So it was extremely disappointing. In terms of these three priorities, if I take them in turn, control of access to our exclusive economic zone. The SFF had always been very clear with government, be it ministers and officials, that was absolutely the key element, if you like. I think I've described it as the ace in the pack in my written evidence. Because controlling your sovereign resources in terms of the fisheries resources in your EEZ is a fundamental principle that every independent coastal state should have. And of course, the UK is now an independent coastal state, but because of the arrangements that have been reached in this deal, we don't have the same ability to control these resources. And in fact, as I think many people will understand from the deal, for the first 5.5 years, the so-called, well, it's not so-called, the adjustment period is formally referred to in the treaty, we have no ability, essentially, to control the EU's access into our fishing waters. Certainly, we can control the access of other countries' vessels into our fishing waters, like Norway, for example, and Faroe. But the EU have full access into our waters for this period of 5.5 years. And should we wish to change that in the future, should the UK decide at the end of the adjustment period to reduce or limit the EU's access into our waters, then there are some very potentially hefty sanctions and penalties for doing so. So that's a fundamental failure, essentially, of this deal. It does not confer on the UK the full ability to control access to our waters without the penalties applying. In terms of quota shares, again, the deal falls very far short of what industry and government had both been clear was a priority, securing fairer shares on the basis of something called zonal attachment, which is a scientific-based method that allocates quota shares based on where fish actually are and where they spend different stages of their life, and is not just a system based on historic fishing opportunities. And zonal attachment is the basis of the arrangement between the EU and Norway, for example, and we absolutely wanted it to be the basis of the new arrangement on shares between the UK and the EU. It is not, however, and it falls very badly short of zonal attachment. And as again I've set out in my evidence, in some cases for some of our whitefish, demersal species in particular, we have a particularly bad outcome, which is actually going to limit our fleet, certainly during the period of the adjustment period, and limit our fleet in potentially a very significant and damaging way. The third priority was around having annual negotiations on access and fishing opportunities. Now, the deal does deliver annual negotiations, and those annual negotiations are actually happening as we speak. So there's a bilateral negotiation going on between the UK and the EU at the moment on fisheries. But what that bilateral negotiation cannot do for the period of adjustment, obviously, is have any element of access to waters involved, because that access is already given through the Trade and Cooperation Agreement for the period of adjustment. So yes, there are annual negotiations taking place, but they are not able to. They are not the sorts of negotiations that we had wanted to see, where those negotiations would have been about agreeing access to each other's waters for the year ahead, looking at the quota shares and other technical arrangements. There is no element of access that is now part of those negotiations, and that is a hugely disappointing element and is a really missed opportunity.
Thank you for that. When Boris Johnson was in Scotland a couple of weeks ago, he said, and I quote, "Be in no doubt that over the medium term and much more over the long term, the changes are very beneficial for Scottish fishing. A big increase in North Sea cod, in North Sea haddock, in just the next few years, a 25% increase in overall quota." Will there be a big increase in North Sea cod and North Sea haddock? And will there be a 25% increase in the overall quota, as the Prime Minister said?
The 25% figure is misleading, and we have made this point on a number of occasions since the deal was agreed. The uplift in quota does not amount to 25%. What the 25% refers to is that what has been transferred to the UK from the EU is 25% of the value of what the EU's share was, or what the EU could have taken from UK waters based on prices in 2019. Now, that does not equate to a 25% uplift in quota. I think calculations show that it's actually probably in the region of around about 10%. If I turn to North Sea cod, which you mentioned specifically, at face value, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the annex on fisheries, does appear to give an uplift in the UK's quota of North Sea cod. But the problem, again, as I've set out in my written evidence, is that the baseline for that uplift did not take into account what the UK actually fished. So whilst the UK had a quota share for North Sea cod under the Common Fisheries Policy, the UK was actually able to catch more fish than that share due to other mechanisms within the Common Fisheries Policy. And the baseline on which the uplifts in the Brexit agreement are based do not reflect that the actual outturn. They actually reflect what the starting point was rather than what the UK's outturn was. So in effect, for some of these species, we will actually have less fishing opportunity than we had previously. That's not the case for all species. For some species, there are uplifts, and there's a significant uplift, for example, for mackerel, one of our very important commercial stocks. But for some of the whitefish stocks in the North Sea, the uplifts that the deal provides are very poor. In some cases, will leave us worse off. In terms of that longer term arrangement, if I just go back for a moment to my first answer around access to waters, the deal does make provision for the UK to have a better settlement in future, because we could control access to our waters, we could limit or reduce or have a different agreement with the EU on the amount of access that they have to UK waters, and that would allow us to leverage a better share. But what the deal does is it then brings into play a suite of sanctions on the UK, should it wish to do this. And this would include, for example, potentially introducing tariffs on fishery products, and also the other party, the EU, could claim what are called compensatory measures in relation to the economic and societal impact of a reduction in access into UK waters. So yes, technically there could be a better settlement at the end of the adjustment period should the government of the day decide to take that path. But what we need to do is clearly understand what the consequences of taking that path would be. And it's very important that we spend time understanding the consequences of having a different arrangement in future, because if we aren't able to have a different arrangement in future, if the penalties and sanctions are such that they are disproportionate to the benefit that would be gained, or would be so severe that the UK would decide not to do that, then we are essentially trapped in another arrangement with the EU in perpetuity, where we have a very disadvantaged deal on fisheries. So there is I think I've described it as a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel of the adjustment period, and we have to now spend some considerable time and effort looking at what could be done at the end of that period, and actually discussing with government what their appetite and ambition is for the end of the adjustment period. So there's much to do.
How likely is it that the government would prioritise the fishing industry in the future, given that they have let you down so badly in the deal that's just been passed?
Well, I think what we have to bear in mind also is that the adjustment period is 5.5 years, and there will be a general election before that point. So none of us know who will be in power or what their priorities will be. So that's another element that we have to take into account, that the political landscape that we have now may look very different from the one that we have in 2026.
Okay. Do you feel betrayed by the government?
We feel very badly let down. We feel that the government made repeated commitments and promises to the industry, and these were not met. To say this was a real opportunity to reset the dials on what had been a very unfair settlement for the UK under the Common Fisheries Policy. It was the opportunity to right that wrong. And whilst there is, as I said, a prospect of better days ahead at the end of the adjustment period, we have to understand the consequences of that. So I think there are certainly many on the quayside who feel, rather than feeling optimistic and ambitious about the future, are actually very concerned about the future.
Thank you very much. I'll now pass on to the Deputy Convener, Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Now, just the previous answers on the last question. So if we come to the end of the 5.5-year period, and that's the pinch point for whether we take more control of our own waters, the price for that would appear to be greater tariffs. Is the sector looking at, I mean, what would you do in that case? Do you consider alternative markets to be, because it's a trading partnership with the EU, you'd have to sacrifice the trading partnership to have access to the increased waters. That's the deal that's been done. It's a deal that was predicted. That was a predicted outcome from many, I think, over the past year or so, regardless of what government promises were made. As the sector, is it alternative? What would you do in that situation? Is it alternative markets that are being explored, or is the EU, you see that continuing to be the key market?
The EU is certainly a very important market for fish and shellfish from Scottish waters. And I think this was a point that we made many times in during the period of negotiation before the deal was reached, was that obviously introduction of tariffs would apply in both directions. So if tariffs were to be applied by one party in relation to seafood exports, then it is likely that the other party may look to do the same thing. And there is actually a balance in trade in seafood between the EU and the UK. We have about £1 billion worth going in each direction. I think it's also important to remember, and I think we see this at the moment, and we know that there are, there have been some real difficulties since the turn of the year with the export of products, and I think Jimmy Buchan will talk about that later. But there are many businesses and many jobs in the EU that depend on this product coming from the UK and from Scotland. So we know that whilst there are difficulties at administration level and with the Commission, and there are many issues to resolve, that there are plenty in the business community in Boulogne sur Mer, for example, that are as keen as the UK is to be able to make sure that fish can flow. I would also point as an example to Norway, which has a much more normalised coastal state arrangement with the EU than the UK now has. And Norway has full control over access to its waters, and its annual negotiations with the EU very much are about what access they can have and exchange of fishing opportunities. And Norway pays tariffs for access to the EU market because that was a decision that they considered was one that was worthwhile in order to make sure that they had full control over their fishing waters. So it's a model that already exists.
Thank you. And you mentioned the Commission and issues that are still to be resolved. I don't know if you can comment on the task force that has been, the cross-border task force that's been established, what you would hope the work of the task force will consist of and what you hope they're able to achieve. And maybe as well, could you maybe comment on the UK government's compensation scheme that has been announced and whether it is targeting financial support in the right areas?
Yeah, the task force hasn't yet met, but I think is due to meet tomorrow for the first time. I think there have been many meetings since the turn of the year between the industry and the UK government and the Scottish government to identify, highlight, and address the problems that have arisen with the change in trading status. It was inevitable that there was going to be a different arrangements for trading with the EU when the UK was no longer part of the customs union or the single market. These have been significant in terms of the additional bureaucracy and the systems that have been required. So there has been a lot of, as I say, a lot of discussion between industry and government, both governments, and there has been a lot of good effort made by both governments to crack on and resolve as far as they can the issues that are arising. I think the task force is a useful way to focus some of those discussions and to be able to sort of take things into a very focused arena in terms of identifying the key issues that need to be resolved, working out where the priority needs to be focused, and working with the relevant administrations to make sure that we can move these forward. So I think the important thing for the task force is that it is focused and doesn't get distracted by the wide range of things that might be happening, but that we can essentially crystallise the key issues that need to be addressed, and by having that focus with governments to actually then identify where work needs to be done to make change. In terms of the compensation scheme, the UK government announced that there would be a compensation scheme available for the seafood sector. I think it was probably at least 2 weeks ago now. The detail of that scheme only emerged earlier this week. It's a £23 million scheme, and from reading the guidance as I understand it, it is targeted essentially at exporters. So it will not, I don't think it will provide much support to the actual catching sector, who of course it's part of the catching sector that I represent. So I think my members are unlikely to be able to claim anything through this scheme, despite the fact that many of them will have been affected by reduced prices at market and indeed by reduced fishing activity, because what the sector has had to do is to try to manage landings of fish so that we're not oversupplying the market when there are difficulties in moving the product out of the UK. So, so whilst my membership and many in the catching sector will have been indirectly affected, it does not look to me from the guidance on the UK scheme that they will be eligible to apply for support. I think what the Scottish Government has done, obviously, is announce a scheme for seafood resilience, and around £6.5 million of that scheme is targeted at the shellfish sector, both wild catching of shellfish and shellfish aquaculture. That will be very welcome, because the shellfish industry has certainly been hit by these problems, and we're not just looking at the impact of the Brexit changes, but also obviously the impact that COVID is still having on markets. But I think what I would want to make clear is that it is not only the shellfish sector that has been affected. Our whitefish fleet has also been significantly affected by a very volatile marketplace, very volatile prices on the market, and as I said, having to essentially limit their fishing activity at the moment to make sure that the market is not oversupplied. So whilst that scheme is very welcome, I would like to make clear that the government may need to look beyond the shellfish sector and also look at the whitefish sector.
Okay. Thank you. Can I ask if Jimmy Buckham would like to respond to the same questions about the task force and the compensation scheme?
Members, thank you for allowing me to come and give some evidence. The task force, as I said, hasn't started yet, but there are a number of key issues that I will need to be raising with that, and so it must remain completely focused and deliverable on its actions. So time will only tell how successful that will be. To go on the compensation scheme, I think it has been badly issued again. There has been no direct dialogue with industry. It's okay to launch these schemes. £23 million is a lot of money, but the industry has also hemorrhaged a lot of money. And some key concerns is the eligibility of who can apply and on what grounds they can apply. So there are many unanswered questions, and I think there's going to be a lot of businesses are going to be really angry and upset that they have made financial losses, but yet are not able to apply for the scheme and as it is written at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Convener. 4 years ago, on the 17th of January 2017, I took the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, the Sea of Opportunity campaign, to Parliament for a debate. And I'm directing my question at Jimmy. One of the things I said there seems now to have been ruinously optimistic. I said even the worst case scenario could leave us able to sell into the EU. And of course, we find in the shellfish sector that there is an absolute ban on certain of our valuable products, important for many small communities around the coast of Scotland, but also in practice, although there are barriers that there are many. What steps does the seafood folk that you represent, Jimmy, like to see that you think we can see within the agreement that's been made that might offer any sort of relief to the very substantial difficulties the industry is facing in exporting to the EU? Jimmy.
Thank you for your question. Well, there probably are a number of things that can be done, and I think that's where the governments, and I'm speaking plural here, of both Scotland and the United Kingdom, need to sit down with their counterparts in the EU, because we've got to find a more slicker, smoother, faster route to market. Now, I know people will be critical of that, But listen, all things are possible. What you need in this situation is a willingness on both sides, and better outcomes can flow from that. I'm not going to hide behind the fact that the deal that we now have falls far short of any aspiration of anyone in the seafood trade, whether you're a catcher, a processor, or even a logistics operator. It is the worst case scenario, where we're now having businesses struggling to get seafood into market. What other things that can be done, because we are where we're at, so what we've got to do is now work through the issue case by case and item by item, is look at what needs to be put in place to help improve the situation and get things back to some sort of normality, although this is the new normal. And what I mean by that is, can government give assistance to help the cost of the health certificates, the paperwork trail? All these things cost money. And even in a small company, if he now has an extra £200 per consignment and he's got 5 consignments a day, he's looking at £1,000 has got to come out the bottom line of his business. And that's where small business has been hit really, really bad with this. So we've got to look at a system that compensates for that loss, or we're going to lose that business. That would encourage more of the small traders perhaps to start trading again, because it is part of the reason we are where we're at, is the cost is part of the blockage. Not only the paperwork, but also the profitability of trying to do a deal. So there are many things we can do. I think I've also suggested a number of times now that we should be looking at a Scottish Customs clearinghouse. That means the products are all cleared in Scotland, and the seafood, because it's a perishable good, can flow far faster into Europe, and it doesn't have the border controls. But again, that's political will. That is far beyond where I'm allowed to negotiate. All that I can do is put forward the suggestions to try and solve our issues.
Thank you. That's interesting, particularly Scottish Customs Clearinghouse, because as we know, for example, the Irish had American immigration officers based at Dublin Airport to support the free passage of passengers into the United States. So no, this is something for which there is a model that already exists. And if we had, in particular, perhaps French customs officials or people authorised by the French Customs Service in Peterhead and other important centres, perhaps in the distribution centres, and send me to say, and I'm not going to try, that would be very helpful. But you mentioned, Jimmy, that both governments should sit down with the EU. Given that the UK government has been extremely resistant to allowing the Scottish government into this process, and indeed is barring Scottish ministers from the task force that will meet tomorrow, do you think, therefore, the Scottish government should take its individual steps on an unofficial basis, because that's the only way it can be, to directly approach Europe and have appropriate discussions?
Oh, it's far from me to say what we can do officially and unofficially. I only represent the industry. That's a decision that you, the politicians, have to make. So I'm afraid I'm going to decline to directly answer to that. But it is my understanding that the chair of this new task force has spoken with one of your colleagues, the Fisheries Minister for Scotland. And I would encourage that he is part of that, very much part of that group, because we've got to solve this together. And I cannot emphasise that enough. So as going into that meeting, I'm not going in to sit with one side and then find that it's working against the other government. I think both governments got to be in there, sitting around the table with the stakeholders, and therefore that's certainly the focus that I have at the moment. That it's got to be a joint approach, and we've got to just strip the politics out of this. I know that it's highly politicised, But at the end of the day, we've got to remember this is about people's livelihoods, it's about people's jobs, and it's about rural economies. And I cannot emphasise enough that things can be solved, but there's got to be a willingness from all sides, and that includes the state, the suppliers as well.
Thank you, Jimmy. I know that Fergus Ewing has always had a very good personal and practical working relationship with his UK opposite numbers. So I've never thought, you know, there were barriers of that kind. And indeed, Jimmy, you and I historically have represent different political traditions, but it's never stopped us talking and working together. So we know it can be done, and you know, we're both going to nod to that. Let me move to Elspeth, if I may, and just as my final question, pick up on that issue, because Jimmy has made very clear that Scottish government should be represented by ministers in the TASK group tomorrow, and it appears that's not the case, although I know that Scottish ministers have been consulted to some degree about it. Would it, like Jimmy, Elspeth, would you feel it would be helpful for the maximum number of people who've got influence over actual outcomes to be sitting in the room discussing the difficulties which we all acknowledge that we have? Elspeth.
Thank you. You'll forgive me if I'm not fully up to date. I've actually been on leave for a few days this week and haven't entirely caught up with all of my emails. But my understanding was that the Scottish Government was indeed being invited to join the task force, and that is my expectation in relation to the meeting that I believe is scheduled for tomorrow. But that's the current situation as I understand it. But if that is not the most up-to-date one, then that's possibly because I am not up-to-date with following my email trails.
It's quite possible I'm behind the curve as well, but my understanding it's only Scottish Government officials who've been invited, that the ministers are not invited. And I have decision, particularly given the good interworking relationships that exist between the responsible ministers north and south of the border. You know, it's not as if you'd be introducing two bulls who are going to charge at each other in the room. There would be common cause between ministers. So, but I'll leave it there, convener, and let the next person come in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll bring in Beatrice Wishart and then Jamie Halcrow-Johnson. But Beatrice, if you want to go first.
Thanks, convener, and good morning, panellists. My first question's to Elspeth. You've already indicated the reduced fishing activity and the volatile markets for whitefish, and we know that fish prices in Peterhead, for example, fell by up to 80%. I wondered if you could give an indication of the number of boats that are landing catches in Denmark. That was referenced early on last month, and I wonder if there are still high levels and what those levels might be of landings in Denmark.
Thank you. I don't have detailed numbers at my fingertips, but I understand that some Scottish boats are still landing in Denmark. I think it's important that we recognise too that at this time of year it would not be unusual for some vessels to be landing there, just based on the fishing patterns at this time of year. But certainly during part of January and I believe continuing to some extent, some vessels have continued to do that. It isn't an option that's open to everybody. It would tend to, I think, be the larger vessels that would be doing that, and the ones obviously fishing in the North Sea, not perhaps those fishing on the west of Scotland. It would be a very long and expensive trip. So as far as I say, I'm afraid I don't have numbers at my fingertips, but I believe that there are still some Scottish vessels landing there, and however, it isn't an option available to everybody. That obviously has an impact. It obviously has a cost for the vessel in terms of they have additional fuel costs to make that journey there and back. But some of the vessels will have taken the decision that that is a price worth paying in terms of a more stable market at Handsome compared to at home. There, of course, will be an impact on our home ports. So if that fish is being landed in Denmark instead of Lerwick or Peterhead, then that's obviously having an impact on those businesses. So That is the current situation.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I was going to reference, I mean, things like the weather at this time of year as well. So it's not unusual, but I just was trying to get an idea of the difference between previous years and this year's. Turning to Jimmy, could I ask, you've already indicated about the costs to particularly small producers and the process of getting products from Scotland to the EU market. Where exactly do you see the flashpoints?
Well, it seems to be an ever-changing picture. I mean, originally the problems were at the hubs. Now, we've sorted out quite a lot of these problems, and we are moving fish much more smoothly than we were, this is week 5-6, than we were day 5-6. So the industry has progressed quite significantly. The larger operators who are remaining away from groupage are managing to send whole lorry loads. So there is a kind of difference between the bigger companies who are able to have the resources, have the wherewithal to send full loads, as opposed to the smaller operators that depend on the groupage and the hubs. But it seems to flare up from different points. There's getting some reports back saying that where the border control posts are slow, there are still issues coming up there, whether the colour of the ink of the stamp on the paperwork is the correct. So again, I have called that there should be a kind of industry standard right across the EU, UK, Scotland. So we all are singing off the same hymn sheet. Where we're turning up that one border control post can accept paperwork, and another one flashes up that the colour of the signature is in the wrong ink. That needs to be ironed out, and it's that kind of anomalies that is causing problems and lack of confidence to put more fish into the system, because you don't know if the product you've bought is actually going to reach market. But I think it's because we've now got a friction at the border, and that is where we need to make sure that any increase in volume can actually cope, that fish doesn't get stuck at the border control post. And that's why I'm suggesting, moving forward, we should be looking at the opportunity of a Scottish Customs clearinghouse, so that the seafood, because it's a perishable and time limited, can actually be approved, signed and sealed in Scotland, so therefore it can go right through into Europe, into Boulogne-sur-Mer, to the thousands of jobs that depend on the seafood there, and help business to be able to operate fairly. So there are lots of things we can do, but they're not a quick fix.
Thank you. Thanks, convener.
Thanks very much. Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you very much, convener. Good morning to Elphas and to Jimmy. I was actually going to pick up on some of the points that have just been made there, so if I could maybe expand on them. We had REC committee last night with representatives of the seafood sector and a number of other kind of key areas around hauliers, and the points that Jimmy was making just there around, some of the blockages and different coloured ink, some of the perhaps inexperienced border staff in other countries. I think France and Holland were highlighted as examples, and also regulations not being followed in Europe. So where a regulation is quite simple, what is required, they're not being followed in part. So obviously that is a growing or has been a real issue. Although there seemed to be some positivity from some of the panelists yesterday that was being addressed. Obviously, there's still kind of concerns about the level of paperwork being asked to be completed, and there was a call for e-certificates and the like. But one of the areas that was brought up was from Andrew Charles, and he flagged up some of the smaller producers, the cost of that paperwork and those certificates are expensive. I was just wondering if, perhaps Jimmy first, whether you'd support some sort of cap on the cost of that required paperwork, those e-certificates, for some of the smaller producers to make it more viable. I wonder if that's something that might be a positive approach.
Jamie, yeah, thank you for that. That is definitely something that I have been calling for. I think we need to get everybody back into their normal practice of exporting, regardless of size or scale. And as I said earlier in one of the questions, one of the prohibitions of that is the sheer cost for small operators. So we've got to be able to find a solution that allows the small operators to be able to trade, but at the same time it's fair and equal right across the whole trading spectrum, because you kind of have on one side of the industry some sort of financial aid to help them to compete in the same market. So whatever it is, it's going to be a fair system that allows everyone. But I do think that where we're at right now, if we do not do something, we are going to lose small traders. And as we all know, everyone in the economy accounts. So we shouldn't be able to letting market forces take its toll here. I think the government needs to act, and it needs to act fast. And it's something that I certainly have been calling for. So I still support that view.
Thanks, Jimmy. And Elspeth, what would your opinion of that be? I'm afraid you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I don't really have anything to add to what Jimmy's said there. I think that sets it out well.
Okay, thank you. Just to clarify, my understanding in relation to the task force, and I know that there are points have obviously been made, is that the Scottish ministers and officials have all been invited to be part of the task force. I mean, I suppose I can ask both of you: would you hope that Scottish Minister Fergus Ewing was involved in that, albeit I know that there are concerns that from the Scottish Government they're not being asked to co-chair, but would you want them to be involved and attend those task force meetings? Sorry, maybe if I come to you, Elspeth, first.
I think it would be hugely beneficial for them to be involved. As Jimmy, I think, said earlier, what we want to do here is take the politics out of this. This isn't about politics. It's about trying to resolve issues and make it easier for our businesses to continue operating, and that is in everybody's interest. Fergus Ewing has been, we know, very active and very vocal in raising these issues with the UK government through EXO committee, and he's been very actively involved in talking to the industry directly. So he has a very good understanding of the issues that the industry is facing, and I think it would be very beneficial for him to be involved. And as I said, and as Jimmy said, this is about taking the politics out of it and actually getting on and making the systems work better.
Thanks. And Jimmy?
This is a task force. It's got a job to do, and at the heart of this is Brand Scotland. And I think it is absolutely critical that the minister who represents the Scottish interests needs to be at that table. Now, whether that's popular or not, but I'm saying it now. I think the fisheries minister who's representing the industry needs to be at the table, because this is not about politics. This is about actions and deliverance. The task force won't get off its feet if we can't strip the politics out, get round the table and sort out and get us going, because there are people's jobs and lives at risk here. But there's one thing I would just like to add to that. It's not to your question. Last week, because it was reported about the 80% drop in fish, remember there is a pandemic, but last week in Peterhead, fish was 1.20 more expensive than it was the same period last year. So the point I'm trying to make here is we're saying the fish has dropped in price, but fish is a variable and it does go up and down, and it is to do with supply and demand. So I just needed to make sure that point is put across, because 80% sounds a huge drop, but the same week last year, fish was £1 more inexpensive than it was this week last year.
Thanks, Jimmy. That's really helpful, because I think there has been Can I ask one very quick question, convener, as well? And I'm sure I know we're limited on time. One of the issues that was raised yesterday, so one of the points that was raised yesterday was that areas like groupage had improved. In fact, DFDS, obviously a major haulier, were talking about that. and they were able to now guarantee next day, albeit with slightly extended timescales. We've seen huge issues since beginning of January, but it's steadily got better. Would you both recognise that things have improved, but that while there is still a way to go in terms of the transport and the export, that things have improved considerably, since the beginning of January? Sorry, maybe it's Jimmy first, and then.
Yeah, definitely. As I said, in week 5, 6, we're in a much better position than we were in day 5, 6 of this year. But we are a long, long way off from being able to scale up to what would possibly be our normal export logistics. So there is much work to be done. But I do still think that there are a number of companies out there that still need some help. This is a huge change in their operational practices. For small businesses, I know what it is to operate a small business. You're so busy in the business that the administration is quite cumbersome and overpowering, and simple mistakes can be made. And I think this is one of the other things I would like to raise at this point. We have to achieve 100% pass rate in every single paper that is presented. Now, in the best ball of the world, we're humans and we all make errors. So until we get some sort of understanding that simple errors are acceptable, we are going to be under this strict regime that unless it's 100% pass rate, we are going to be in a restricted flow of goods, because there has got to be some sort of common sense prevails that simple errors can be acceptable, but I'm finding that very difficult, because business, as I say, are humans. It's humans that's behind this, and we all make these simple little errors. It might just be a stroke, and it might just be a digit, but it's so important. And I think that's where the industry is struggling a wee bit with this.
Thanks, Jimmy. And maybe Elf, just very quickly as well, please.
On the ground detail of this through his membership than I am, but my sense certainly is that yes, things are better now than they were in the first 2 weeks of January, but that there is still a long way to go. And as Jimmy has already alluded to, we're not at full export volumes or capacity at the moment. I was in a meeting yesterday where Donna Fordyce of Seafood Scotland said, we're not that far away from Easter, although it may not feel it sitting here in Deeside looking out at a foot of snow on the ground. But Easter isn't far off, and that's a particularly busy spell for seafood exports. So, we're only really looking 6, 7, 8 weeks away from export capacity needing to be much greater, and for the systems to be working much more efficiently. So, whilst things are improving, my understanding is that there's still a way to go.
No complacency and lots of work for the task force to do. Thank you very much, and thank you, convener.
Thank you very much. Kenneth Gibson next. Do we have Kenneth Gibson? I don't know if we have him. We seem to have lost Kenneth. Ross, would you like to come in now? I sprung that upon you. Ross Greer.
Yes, can do, convener. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
This it somewhat relates to Jamie's last line of questioning, actually, so it's convenient. We've heard reports over the last couple of weeks since the start of the year of the impact on the road haulage industry and the changes to that industry as a result of challenges getting on to mainland Europe. There have been reports of lorries increasingly travelling to mainland Europe empty, so not importing goods from the UK to Europe, travelling to the mainland to collect a consignment and to import it back here. Obviously that has an impact on any UK producer who's looking to export. I'm wondering what discussions you've been having with the road haulage industry recently, what impact you've seen on producers in your sector, given what's happening to lorries that are getting stuck, and particularly for goods like seafood, the consignment is being spoiled before it can be exported?
I'm presuming that's targeted at me, Ross. Thanks for that question. I have been engaging with the three main hubs, which is Mesquin, O'Toole and DFDS in the Central Belt. And to be fair, there's a lot of commercial sensitivities there, so they are limited to what they want to share with me. But as far as engagement goes, I have to say that they are engaging, not daily, but certainly weekly, and we are working through problems that we've got with my particular members, that things are being flagged up. We're able to take that away and go and engage with our members and try and speed up the system. But what they're doing commercially, going with empty lorries or full lorries, that's something that I haven't shared with us at this time.
Thanks. I mean, are you noticing any impact at all with producers at your end finding it harder to get hauliers willing to take their loads, or is that not yet having any impact at your end of the process?
No, I mean, look, there was enough transport logistics there prior to the UK leaving the EU, so that infrastructure is still there. I think it's the confidence of and the speed of the system to be able to scale up, I think, is what I think is restricting it, rather than the logistics having moved elsewhere. I think that business is business, and the logistics will respond to demand, but it can only respond to demand if the flow either way works effectively. Because if you've got lorries trapped on one side, you need lorries to return to be able to pick up the next consignment. So it's the speed of the outward and inward journeys are probably critical to this, and that's why we've got to get border control posts from the producer right through, flowing faster, slicker, smoother.
Thanks, Jimmy. Unless Elspeth's got anything in particular to add on that, the other questions I was going to ask were covered by Jamie in relation to these kind of quirky admin issues around the colour of ink used and things like that. So that would be all from me, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. We now have Kenneth Gibson back with us, so I'll bring in Kenneth Gibson.
But welcome to our panellists, and thank you, Convener. I hope I don't go cover any ground that I inadvertently missed. I mean, well, I think for me, looking at this as a layperson from the outside, what I'm looking at is, because of all the difficulties we've had in the first few weeks, governments both north and south of the border have struggled to provide support for the industry, and I'm sure that's been very welcome. But my concern is the long-term future. Clearly, the loss of markets, not just in the short term, but the long term. I mean, you know, you can argue about quotas, but if nobody is buying the fish, or fewer people buying fish, then that's obviously going to be a major issue. So what are you looking for as an industry from both governments, north and south, to ensure that there is assistance in trying to reclaim any markets that are lost once the issues that we face are minimised, if indeed they can be? I'm quite happy to take that from any panellist that wants to volunteer to respond first.
Shall I kick off? I think I said earlier that there are people in Europe who want our product. There are people who want to eat it. There are businesses that want to process it and sell it. There will hopefully, before too much longer, be restaurants reopening and hospitality reopening, and people wanting to go out again and eat out and enjoy our great produce. So the market is there. It's been difficult getting the product to market at the moment, and the markets have been depressed because of the impact of COVID. And we were having not dissimilar discussions some months ago when we were feeling the impact of COVID. So it's very much about what governments and industry can do collectively and collaboratively to make sure that we maintain these markets. I think Jimmy spoke a moment ago about Brand Scotland, and we have to make sure that use the vehicles of both governments and industry's own efforts to make it as streamlined as possible to continue to get product to market, because that market is there and it wants the product. So let's make every effort that we can collaboratively to meet that demand. Speaking about the longer term, I spoke at the beginning about the handcuffs, if you like, that we feel in the catching sector that the Brexit deal has put upon us. But I would also want to point out that there are some upsides. I think something that we feel is a benefit for us going forward is that the deal does give now the UK regulatory autonomy in terms of our fisheries management. And that's something that we need to be looking at in the shorter and the long term in terms of how we manage our fisheries and support our industry in doing that. And I hope that this Parliament will have an important role in that, because obviously fisheries management is a devolved competence, and the Fisheries Act that was passed last year with the legislative consent of the Scottish Parliament gives very significant powers to the devolved administrations in terms of fisheries management. So there is much that we can do going forward to take the industry away from some of the very prescriptive, inflexible, top-down, heavy rules of the Common Fisheries Policy and move us to much more flexible, innovative, adaptable legislation to actually make sure that we can manage our fisheries better. And I think whilst we are, we are currently rightly, fixated and focused on the immediate problems that we have and some of the real headline issues that we're seeing at the moment, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that actually we are now an independent coastal state. We may have handcuffs on in terms of access and quota, but we are not handcuffed in the same way around our regulatory autonomy, the ability to do things differently in UK waters. And that's a really important thing that I think this Parliament will have a key role to play in going forward.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I mean, I'm pleased at the optimism of the sector. Mr. Buchan, in terms of costs and competitiveness, Elspeth just talked about the reduction, for example, in regulatory oversight, perhaps. Maybe that's not the correct word, but a different regulatory regime. So overall, what are we looking at in terms of the overall impact, do you believe, on this sector? So, for example, because of the Brexit decision, once we get through the first few months, is it there going to be a kind of, is it going to be effectively neutral? Is there going to be a kind of, is the sector going to be 5% less better off in terms of its position in the marketplace? I mean, I realise that's difficult to quantify, but where are we in terms of being able to compete in markets? And if there is a negative differential, are you looking for government to fill that gap, or are you looking just for the industry to become leaner and meaner?
Well, I think right now the deal that we've got at the moment, we've got imbalance in trading arrangements where the EU are still enjoying the full benefits of free Brexit. There are no tariffs, no controls. They just load the products on and they send it to the UK. Where we're at is we've obviously got this new system that we've had to adhere to from the 1st of January. So I think until we get nearer that point, that you may find that there may not be a willingness to sit down and discuss it. But I'm pretty sure that if the EU importers are finding the same arrangements that we are as exporters, I think very quickly there will be unrest, or not unrest, but there will be a lot of voices raised and a more willingness to maybe discuss this more openly. So that would be one of the points that I would like to raise in this. On the future, well, this industry doesn't want to be having to depend on money from government. The government control quite a lot of the key cards here. What they've got to do is unlock the doors. Industry is ready and willing to look at any market opportunity, but the government sometimes hold the keys to these doors, and unless you unlock them and make things easier for industry, then we're going to continue to have problems. I mean, one of the issues that I would like to see raised and discussed is some sort of alignment of standards. Where we've now considered that our bivalves were kind of unacceptable to go into the EU, but they were okay in December. I mean, the water hasn't changed. That is political interference, and it's governments that need to strip this out and realise that we are trading nations. We don't have to be politically aligned, but we're still trading nations, and we will benefit from trading either way. And as long as there are restrictions in there, it will be industry, business, and people that will suffer from these outcomes, in my opinion. But as I say, it's all about political will and giving the industry the ability and the tools to do the job that it wants to do.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I mean, I'm sure the industry wants to have as little to do with government as possible if it can, and just get on with the job that fishermen and others related to the industry want to do. But I think it's difficult, though. I mean, the British government is in a position whereby it's effectively not putting up barriers, and therefore there's not really much incentive for the EU to lower its barriers, given the fact that it's getting all the advantages and none of the disadvantages in this. So that's a particular difficulty. Do you, Mr. Buchan, and indeed yourself, Ms. McDonald, do you fear that, for example, the transitional agreement will de facto become permanent? I mean, obviously, we're talking about 5 years, but do you think that that's possibly it could just end up never really moving forward, or are you confident that it will actually ultimately deliver for fishing communities?
Well, if I could just very briefly come in, again, I'm not close enough to senior politicians or even in government or even negotiation to be able to answer that. That's only a question that can periodically be raised from time to time. But right now, where we're at right now is probably not in a good position. But we must never give up. We must keep working, and with willing partners, we can resolve a lot of our issues and have some sort of normality. Might not be new normal. Would be the words that I would have to use, because we are in a completely new trading platform. But equally, as I say, when things change for the other side, you may find a more keener and more eager counterpart to come back to the table to say, well, this actually is not working for us either. How can we make it better? Because at the end of the day, we are trading nations, and I keep saying that. Politics gets in the middle of this, and therefore we've got to deal with that. But as I said, the politicians are the one that can unlock these doors. But as Elspeth said earlier on, we don't even know what government will be in power 5.5 years from now. So it's a very difficult prediction to make, and one I wouldn't even like to care to make.
Yes, I mean, I appreciate. I did hear Elspeth actually say that. And Elspeth, just before you respond, the Hague preference has been lost, which is a $9 million, an estimated £9 million impact on the industry. So, how do you feel, for example, that can be made up again, so to speak? How can that money be replaced?
Yeah, I think your original question about do we, is there a risk that we find ourselves in this situation, this adjustment period actually becomes a permanent arrangement? And I think that absolutely is a concern, and it is a real worry for more than a worry, a real existential anxiety for the industry that the arrangements of the adjustment period become permanent. And that is why we need to do the work now within industry, with governments, both north and south, in terms of understanding what the impacts would be of a change to these arrangements. And, as Jimmy and I have both now said, that, none of us can predict what the political landscape will look like then, but we we can at least do the work to understand what the impact of changing the current arrangements on access would look like. But I think I said in some of my opening remarks that there is a risk that if we aren't able to make changes to the current arrangements, then we do find ourselves trapped in another long-standing disadvantageous relationship with the EU on fisheries, whereby we may indeed be a coastal state now, which we weren't when we were a member of the EU and were constrained by the CFP, but we would be a coastal state with our hands tied behind our backs and simply not having that same normalised relationship with the EU and fisheries that Norway and Faroe, for example, have. In terms of your specific question around Hague preference, losing the mechanisms of international quota swaps and the Hague preference from the common fisheries policy, obviously we knew that would happen when the UK was no longer in the CFP, and that's why it was so important to make sure that the baseline for the quota uplifts included these mechanisms, and that was what the government failed to secure. What the treaty does make provision for is for there to be international exchanges between the two parties. So, the bilateral discussions that are happening at the moment between the UK and the EU on fisheries arrangements for 2021, while they will not be able to have any element of access, because that has already been conceded through the treaty, there is an opportunity for the UK and the EU to exchange what we call fishing opportunities, so to make some exchanges of quotas for the year ahead, and the UK has been very clear that will be a priority for us. So there's the opportunity to do that through these annual rounds of negotiations that will happen, but there will also be other opportunities for international exchanges to take place between the parties during the year, and that mechanism has not yet been established, and it will be a mechanism that will be overseen by the Specialised Committee on Fisheries, that is one of the new bodies that must be set up through the requirements of the treaty. So we need to establish these new mechanisms quickly, because it is now a priority that we are able to bridge those gaps between our new shares and what we would have been able to secure through swaps and the Hague preference mechanisms. So there's provision there. We now need to make sure that these are prioritised and that these can be put in place as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Elspeth. Thank you, Jimmy. Back to you, Camilla.
Thank you very much. We now have Dean Lockhart, followed by Christine Graham.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Elspeth and Jimmy. I would like to follow up. Quite a few of my questions have been answered, but I'd like to follow up on the discussions around regulatory autonomy under the TCA, which will enable a new fisheries management system to be introduced. Elspeth, you said that this will allow us to move away from some of the sort of impractical, inflexible regulations in the CFP, and that there were significant devolved powers in this area. Wondered if you could just highlight some of the specifics that you would be looking for, or the sector could look for, in terms of arranging a more sort of bespoke fisheries management system for Scotland as well as the rest of the UK.
Yeah, sure. An example comes immediately to mind would be the landing obligation, the Common Fisheries Policy landing obligation, which was essentially a political mechanism put in place, a political fix, if you like, to a real practical fisheries management problem. And it was related to the discarding of fish, which nobody wants to do. But in practical terms, it is unavoidable in some cases, particularly where you have the sorts of mixed fisheries that we have in our demersal fisheries in the North Sea. And the EU's landing obligation was very much a political fix to, as I say, what was a practical problem. And what we need to have is actually a practical solution to a practical problem rather than a political one. And the regulatory autonomy that we now have in the UK through the agreement and through the powers of the Fishery Bill will enable us to actually look at how do we address the issue of discards in the future in the UK and in Scotland. And we have already started a dialogue with Marine Scotland on that. Marine Scotland published a strategy document just before Christmas, setting out their ideas and thinking around the future of fisheries management. Oh, I'm sorry if you can hear a background noise there. It's my puppy squeezing a leaky toy. So I think some of these ideas in the future fisheries management document sort of set the framework for how we can move forward in some of these issues. So, you know, the issue of discarding fish is not something the industry doesn't want to discard fish any more than other people don't want to see the industry discarding fish. But we have to recognise that it is a practical problem and that we need to find a better way of addressing it that actually, you know, allows us, for example, to take discards into account when we're doing scientific analysis of stock assessments, etc. So that's one example of how we can find better solutions to practical problems, and that these solutions can be determined based on our own specific circumstances and are not a compromise made up to try and address the circumstances of many different countries.
Thanks very much, Elspeth. That sounds reasonably optimistic in terms of some of the benefits we can look forward to in fisheries management. And I wonder, Jimmy, is fisheries management and changes to the system, is that something that will benefit your members directly, or is it more on the sort of catching side of the sector?
It is definitely much one for the catching sector, but remember, we are an integrated supply chain, so any benefits or disadvantages that affect the catching sector obviously has an impact on the onshore side of things. And for example, I think what Elspeth highlighted earlier, that in real terms that there will be some cases in the whitefish that our whitefish catchers will have less fish or fishing opportunities this year. Now, that has a direct impact on my members who cannot just simply tie up. They've got staff to pay, they've got business rates to adhere to, they've got all the things that come with normal business, but if they've got less raw material, then that has got a significant impact on the operations of that business. And it's that kind of knock-on effect that creates huge problems, not only in the exporting, but I'm speaking about just in fish processing in general, that we are struggling with. And that's why one of the things that I would be calling for is some infrastructure investment to improve innovation, definitely improve efficiencies, and let's get our factories modernised and up to date so that we can compete not only in a UK domestic EU level, but on a global level as well. I mean, there are opportunities, and we've got to look to the future and be adventurous, dare I say, that although we have huge problems at the moment, we must never stop being outward looking and looking for the best interest of everyone in the supply chain.
Okay. Well, look, Jimmy and Elspeth, we're up against the clock, but I really appreciate those very helpful replies. And Convener, I know we're running against the time a bit, so I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Dean. And Christine Graham is our last questioner.
Yeah, I'm a real tail end Charlie here, and an absolute greenhorn about the fishery business, and much more even than my colleague Kenneth Gibson. However, listened to this for ages, and I agree, I wish politics wasn't in this. But we went out of the EU to take control back of the fishing and to get rid of a lot of red tape. As far as I can see, none of that's happened. I mean, I'm looking at this saying that you have 71 pages of paperwork to export 1 lorry of fish. And Mr. Buchan has explained a tiny wee mistake on one of the bits of paper and everything goes down the tubes. I'm also reading that 76% of all seafood exports from Scotland went to the EU, worth £703 million a year. That's a big chunk of your economy. And I'm also looking at Mr. Buchan's quote. these are not minor impediments to trade. The industry in Scotland has basically ground to a halt, and businesses employ hundreds of people in communities around our coast and are losing money, and in some cases are going to go under. Now, this is a big, big problem, and my issue with you, and if I can ask the panel, is how on earth is the UK, having just agreed this treaty, with, it seems to me, all the aces in the pack being in the hands of the other European countries, going to get you a better arrangement over the next 5 years? I've got huge concerns about this because I can't see what cards the UK has to play here. And my second point would be, while this mess is going on for you, I have huge sympathy for you in this. What are your competitors going to do? Because they'll see a gap in the market, surely. And I know Spanish fishermen and whatever will start just jumping in and taking your trade. So I appreciate you want to take the politics out. I'm not talking party politics here. I'm talking about, you know, cross-nations politics here. I really can't see, tragically, I can't see how you're going to get much better. You might tweak it a bit, but I can't see how you're going to get much better over the next 5 years. Please tell me I'm wrong.
Elspeth?
Mr. Buchan, come on. You're the man.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. I'm just waiting for the lead.
You're a man of the sea. You're a man of the sea. Your hands on. I like you. Let me hear from you.
Right. I can't disagree with what you're saying. You've highlighted it absolutely splendidly from your point of view. From my point of view, politics was very much involved in this, and there were many opportunities in the last 4 years we could have done things differently. But politics opposed it from every angle. Everyone was against everything that anyone wanted to do. And what we finished up in the end is the worst of the worst of the worst, in my opinion. There were many opportunities, I said, right from the get-go. We could have got in the room, we could have done something, we could have stayed in the single market, we could have stayed in the customs union, we could have been out of Europe. That was an option on the table. It was rejected. So I cannot take the blame for what has happened politically, because I am only one person and I represent one industry. What we've got to do now, you're absolutely right, it doesn't look good. But if we can get back in the room and we can start to work collectively, both governments, and I keep emphasising that, along with our EU counterparts, we have to find new palatable trading arrangements. Now, yes, it is a big ask, but I do have to emphasise there will come a point in the next few weeks that the EU needs to import to us as well. We are a huge nation, and we are important to them as we are important to them. So there has to be some sort of reciprocal agreements that will improve this situation. And I know it does look a big ask, but I'm a great believer that good things can happen if there is a willingness by all sides. But if we keep opposing ourselves and tearing ourselves apart, then politically that's where we're going to finish up, in the wilderness, where everyone is dissatisfied with everything that we've done.
Okay. I want competitors.
Elspeth, do you want to come in?
Yes, if I could, thank you. I was just going to say that certainly in the period before this deal was concluded, the catching sector, my membership certainly was clear that getting a good deal in fisheries could be a real demonstrable benefit of leaving the common fisheries policy. The UK government has not secured a good deal on fishing, so that benefit has not been delivered. It may be down the road after the 5.5-year adjustment period, but as I've said a couple of times this morning, that is not a straightforward solution, and there is a lot that we need to do to look at what that world might look like and what it would mean. It is beneficial that we have our regulatory autonomy in our own waters. That is a big step forward, and we must make sure that we take advantage of that. That is something that the industry is very supportive of. But it's interesting, actually, on the fisheries agreement overall, interesting to note that whilst we're not happy about it in the UK industry, much of the EU industry isn't happy about it either. So it hasn't been a fisheries deal that they feel is good from their perspective. So I would just conclude on that point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Christine, did you want to come back?
No, I've learned a lot from listening to it. I mean, there's a lot of this, a very technical and very detailed area, and my concern would be that over the 5 years, and even immediately, and I hear what has been said, Ms McDonald, that the other competing fishing nations will take over and in the meantime, as our onshore, as our processing and everything sinks, or the markets sink here and things are sold in Denmark and so on, that they will take over. And once markets are lost and cannot be reclaimed. So I'm sorry to be sort of downbeat, but that's how, as somebody that has a rural economy, no fishing in my patch except salmon. That's how my take on it. So extremely thank the panel. Very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if the panel's aware of the story that's run 6 hours ago in the Financial Times, which said that Brussels has rejected UK requests to overturn an export ban on live shellfish. The European Commission officials told the FT that Brussels would not grant the UK a special export health licence for the trade in live bivalve molluscs. I don't know if Jimmy wanted to come in on that.
Well, it's news to me. I mean, haven't had a chance to even read the papers yet because I had to be in here for setting up for this evidence session. So no, as I say, there are political toing and froing back and forth here, but nothing is cast in stone. Again, they are difficult, and there are businesses who are going to be badly affected by this. And that was certainly something that wasn't in my radar about the live shellfish. But we are where we're at, and that's what I'm saying. Sometimes we've got to get government to intervene and help in the short term. But our industry's not here for government handouts. Industry's here to provide work and wealth for the communities that they serve, to pay taxes, to benefit all of the rural community and the wider economy.
Sure. You've both expressed an optimism, a hope that we can get things sorted out and get onto a better footing. If that happened, I don't know it's a big if, but if that happened, would you be able to get back the markets that you had lost in the EU?
From my perspective, I think Brand Scotland, I think Scottish seafood is world class. I'm a huge ambassador for it. I think there's much more that we can do in our own homeland, that is Scotland specific, and in the wider UK. We have just come through a very, very difficult, or we're not come through, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I think that we should be doing much more in promoting the benefits of eating seafood. I think we could do much more in schools to educate tomorrow's mothers and fathers that eating fish is not only good for you, but there's got huge benefits. And there's just so much more we can be doing. But sometimes we become too focused on one thing, and we lost the near market that we have. And it is something that I've been very, very passionate about, that I think we should be doing much more to promote and sell fish to our home nation, albeit we've still got to have a keen eye on our export market. And it is difficult to get back a market that you've lost. But I still stand to this. Geographically, we're well placed in the globe to have the fish and the seas that we've got. Fishermen have done a huge amount in the last 10 to 20 years in sustainability. And if we keep that programme growing, we will have great seafood for years and years to come. And as I say, politicians have a part to play, business have a bigger part. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to come back in, Elspeth? Are you okay?
No, I'm fine with that. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Well, we're just over time, so thank you very much, both of you, Ms MacDonald and Mr Buchan, for attending and for your evidence today. And I know that you had to clock on quite early, and because we had the Cabinet Secretary first, it's just a very long session, and I do really appreciate your patience, so thank you very much. That concludes the public part of this morning's meeting, and I'll allow a couple of minutes for members to have a comfort break, and then we'll move to Microsoft Teams to resume in private session. Thanks very much.